Let's roll. This is Countercharge, your podcast for ranks, flanks, and kings of war. Join your hosts as they delve into the world of Panithor and bring you worldwide coverage of all things Kings of War.
Welcome to Countercharge. I'm James Dunbar.
I'm Erasmus Berger.
And I'm Nathan Arnold, and it's good to be back here in the Loremaster's library. I feel like it's been, unfortunately, a very long time, but life and all sorts of things happen, so we're glad to be here with James to talk, hopefully a lot about Claws on the Plain, which is a book that, as I understand, James, is your first novel, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But for you, this is also the first time you have been on Countercharge, especially here in the Loremaster's library, so if you can, tell us a little bit about your fantasy reading origin stories, how you got going in life with reading these kind of stories, and of course, how that evolved into writing them.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. Long time listener to Countercharge, but it's great to be on. With fantasy, I started, I imagine like many people, I was young and I picked up The Hobbit, and Tolkien's world just completely blew my mind. And that was definitely a starting point. Other obsessions as I grew up, things like obviously Harry Potter was obviously a big generational thing, but also The Wheel of Time was a huge thing for me. And, and then more broadly, like the authors I keep going back to are things like, Stephen King, and, I was a big Black Library reader, of course, when I was younger as well. People like William King and his work on Gotrek and Felix, I thought those were excellent, and really the way they could bring me into Warhammer Fantasy, which was also an obsession when I was younger. And those would be my big things. Obviously, there's too many writers for me to go through. I suppose the most the latest obsession of as a writer would be with this guy Borges. He's an Argentine writer who from the 30s would do like short stories. He's related to things like Lovecraft and all this sort of work. It's just there's so much to pull out from that. But most of my influence will be very familiar, I imagine, to a lot of listeners. The Tolkien and the Wheel of Time and this kind of thing. So yeah.
I think it's interesting you brought in Stephen King and then Lovecraftian authors, because we'll talk about it as we go, and especially in the spoilers section. This is easily the darkest, horror-esque, most Kings of War book that we have had so far. And you may disagree with me, Erasmus, but I was not expecting kind of the directions that this book takes when I started reading it. And you get about halfway in and you're like, okay, this is very different than I was expecting. And by the end of the book, you're at a very different place than where you began. So that is really cool. And I'm hoping, James, that is what you intended to do in this story.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. This book twists and turns a lot. We'll touch on that later. But I feel like the setup to me is pretty obvious that there's a Night Stalker involved, which, as a Night Stalker player, amazing. But if they're Night Stalkers, you're getting dark and twisty horror, right? If you're a Night Stalker player, read this book.
Right.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit, James, about how you got started in just the authoring process with the book, and kind of how you ended up in, the place we are now with the book published, and kind of what got you going.
Well, it was really just playing Kings of War. I got into Kings of War, like many people with the death of the old world, came in with Uncharted Empires into second edition Kings of War. And I forget which year it was, but Mantic ran obviously the big Edge of the Abyss campaign. And that was just so much fun. I got really into that. They had the whole campaign site set up where you would submit your battle reports, and I would, my brother and I would be doing these battle reports with our converted Warhammer Fantasy miniatures, because we were still working on our Mantic armies at that point, we would like do them as these narrative things. And I was just having so much fun with coming up with narratives for these battles. And, I just thought it was just And then that followed on with my brother actually, who I play a lot of these games with. He came up with this whole idea for a further like campaign that we could do with our local group, and so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to run a Kingdoms of Men list for that, and here's my backstory for that, and all this kind of thing. And then that campaign didn't really work out. As these things happen, people can't make it. It doesn't really fall through. But I had this story idea, and I thought, well, that's a cool thing. I'll put that in the back pocket. And then it was literally like a flash of lightning. The whole thing just like sort of one of these, comedic sit bolt upright moments where the whole novel felt like it landed in my head, and I thought, I have to pitch this to Winged Hussar, and I wrote out the first chapter and the prologue, which I really haven't changed much in the final version from what I wrote out and pitched to Brandon. And he scooped it up. He was very excited, which was great. And there was a couple of initial tweaks to not so much to the claws side of the story, but originally I can say that the plan was for their main antagonist rather than orcs was going to be goblins. But Mantic felt like they had obviously Rob Berman was working on goblin stories sort of in the background. It was something coming off. So they thought, well, why not turn this into orcs instead? I mean, it was meant to be orcs invading the plane in the first place in that campaign. So, which made sense. It was a great change and it was absolutely for the best. And from that, that was how I got into writing it. And barring one detour where I took about a year off from writing it to help on Nature's Night, that was my first novel for anyone, but for Wings of Hussar, and it's come out earlier this year. I'm trying to remember. I think it was around April time.
Yeah, April's when it came out this year. I think it's very interesting, and this is a point that's really stuck out to me in our discussions with the authors. We have authors that are published writers that have either sort of jumped on board and are doing work that is related to Kings of War, the World of Panethor, or they're authors like Mark Barber, who has many other works, but he's actually does have a connection to Kings of War in a different way. And so there are these authors that exist out there. And then you have authors like yourself and Mike Rossi and Ben Stoddard, and your first time novels are in this world. And I think it's impressive from Winged Hussar's perspective that they're taking those authors in and they're helping you guys get a work published, and you're kind of putting yourselves out there. But then also for you guys as authors, you get to take the armies that you love, the stories that you love, and the game that you play on the tabletop, and you get to put it into book form. And Winged Hussar is giving those authors that chance and that opportunity. I'm not a writer. I have stories in my head, and if I try to write them, it just never really goes well. It's not how I work. But it is really impressive to me that they are building authors alongside helping us build the world. That's a great thing. And I'm glad you were able to get in, James, and get your perspective, your angle, your work out there for an idea that you had just kind of based on you playing the game and you having that idea. That's really awesome to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I will keep encouraging everybody out there. If you have a story, if you have an idea, touch base with Winged Hussar. They absolutely are looking for good work. They're looking for good authors and good stories in connection with Mantic. So keep up the conversation with them and see if we can get more authors in the space. It's always a good thing. But good insight, James. I appreciate that. I want to make sure before we jump into the book, Erasmus, anything else you want to ask James on the author side of things or the book generally, but before we kind of get into the non-spoiler part of this?
I think that covers things. I felt there was an element of the sort of point of view characters were being led by a non-point of view character to someone was hitching a ride. We won't get into who for what, but in both cases, someone was using the point of view character's nature against them, and they were looking to gain something, but really someone else is choosing the destination for them. But I'm not sure if either of them really realized that at all. But we'll get into that in the next section.
I actually wonder if either of the and I'd say sort of point of view characters, because you get a few different people on the human side that may not be perfect point of view, and this is where I'm not an author, so I know there's terms and things that I don't understand, but a lot of people that are on the human side that don't necessarily have the same goal, but a lot of them are like willing to go along with, here's this thing we're going to get this treasure. And on the orc side, you have Orod, who's the main driving force in the entire experiment, but he's definitely getting tugged along. And I don't think either of the humans or the orcs would be terribly upset that someone was kind of pushing them along, because they're still kind of doing the thing they want to do. But you're absolutely right, Erasmus. There's a lot of hidden information from those main point of view characters from the beginning, and they're just oblivious, and sometimes remain oblivious more or less the entire book. So that's a good call out.
Definitely the orcs are doing what orcs do. They're happy to do it. Someone should steering them rather than leading them. And the mercenaries are looking for treasure. Like, that's what they do as well.
James, tell us a little bit about kind of setting up the book with the two sides that you have at the beginning. What was or I guess we know what was the drive, obviously, with everything going on, but kind of where did you come from with setting that up internally? Obviously, you mentioned you pivoted from goblins to orcs. So tell us a little bit about kind of your thinking and how that was setting up in your brain from writing the story.
Well, I think you've definitely picked up on what I was putting down. I would say, in terms of these two groups, these two broad perspectives, these two narratives that are sort of running alongside one another are sort of dark reflections, or through a mirror darkly, of one another. There's definitely things that they both share, but they're coming at it from different ways. You've got this displaced element to both of them as well. Like, while it is the mercenaries, what the mercenaries are doing, obviously, with their narrative, is helping these displaced people, and then the orcs themselves being escaped slaves from the abyssal dwarves from Tragar, are themselves people without a place. And orcs can be thought of that in the way orcs are sort of set out in Panathor. They don't typically have a place anyway. That's part of their nature, seems to be that they are unsettled, moving constantly. But in particular, these orcs are very much like from this circumstance. So yeah, there was definitely an intent for there to be these reflections between them, and I thought that would be an interesting way. I mean, again, like I was saying before about the idea for this book, it came out of the Edge of the Abyss campaign, where you had these areas that the players would be fighting over, and we had one of the major ones was obviously the Dwarf Civil War and the Halpy Mountains and so on, and we've had a lot of focus on that. And in some ways, the orcs, I would like to think, are sort of part of that. They're a ripple from that. These escaped orcs, they've come out of that chaos and what happened there, and the consequences of the flooding of the abyss and so on. But the other side, that I would tentatively say, I suppose, that the sort of the part of the narrative from the Edge of the Abyss campaign that got the least sort of follow up, just because narratively, I suppose the other stuff was much more interesting. It had a lot more impetus to go forward with. But like that region of the Ardabikian Plains, we didn't really see much of the fall. What really, I remember I was writing most of this book during second edition, and then the release of third edition came out during the process. I was quite far on into it. I remember opening the third edition book and being going to the orc section to see what would it say about, what went on with the orc invasion of the Ardabikian Plains, and there's no mention of it, and it's okay, so in a way, the idea for coming back to your question, there was a sense of I wanted to offer something that follows on from what happened there, and follows on and takes inspiration from what was laid out in what the players did in that campaign. I don't know if you guys took part in the Edge of the Abyss campaign back in the day, but like one of the defining aspects of that region in when people were putting their results in is that it basically never went the orcs' way. It was like permanently in the good guys' hands. They were just getting crushed, but they'd made this big thing out of such a huge invasion. So then you've got to take the narrative forward. You've got to say it was this huge invasion. It did scare the region, so much so that Lord Darvlid was able to get the political will behind him to build this wall and so on. But ultimately it was sort of crushed. And it's like, what are the consequences of that? What does that mean? And then you've got these orcs coming from the east. What's that going to mean for them? What's it going to mean for the men who were assembled at the wall? So yeah, that's a very long answer to your question, but those are the sort of ideas running through my head there with those parallel narratives.
I took part in the Edge of the Abyss. I'm trying to remember when it feels like it's been forever ago since that occurred. It's been a hot minute, that's for sure. A lot of things have happened since that book came out in 2018. I think it was, for me, there was and I won't say a disconnect, but I definitely felt like there were regions of the world that did sort of go quiet. And from what you said, it was kind of like the orcs were like, hey, we're going to have this big invasion, and then rolled in and everybody just smacked them down. So you got a void in the story of Panathor that is there in the plains. It's sort of this big empty space, and we obviously get a little bit back with Broken Alliance with some of the work that Scott Washburn put in. So there's some more of what's going on, but that avoids a lot of the conversation on what the orcs were doing and what was going on. So there was this sort of mystery surrounding before the book begins, on what happened with the invasion. And obviously we don't know everything, but you get some pretty good ideas from the book as to kind of what happened to the orcs and what was going on when they got to sort of where this book ends up as well. So no, that's a good way to look at it. You're sort of filling in some of those pieces that you wanted to see in the story overall. That's good. Erasmus, any thoughts before we jump into theming a little bit?
I think not just with the orcs after the flooding of the abyss, not really dealt with. Orcs haven't really had a lot of page time in general. I often hear it complained about Kings of War and Panathor that the orcs are sort of generic destroy everything creatures. So I think it's a bit overdue for them to get a bit of attention, and in this book they do.
I think orcs in most of the other books, the only times we've seen them are as small bad guys that you run into, and they get killed by some dwarves or get killed by some humans, and they sort of are just a grunt that gets thrown into the story to have a little bit of conflict happen, and you don't get the perspective of an orc in the same way that you get in this book. So it is really good to get that insight. And I hope that there's more coming from orcs, because you definitely get with Orad, you get a lot more of the culture from the orcs. You get a lot of what's going on and how they work and what are the intricate pieces. Obviously, the story isn't 100% focused on them, but it is a lot easier for a human to put their brain into the body of a human that's in that story than it is the orcs. And so you have a lot of great insight, I think, James, as you're going through this. What was it like in this shift from goblins to orcs? Because you mentioned that was a change that you made with, I think you said it was a request of Mantic. How different did that make the story in your eyes, or was it something that was a pretty easy swap out from your perspective?
It was pretty straightforward. I mean, the original, in both cases, I was wanting to follow on with things again from that campaign. So like when it was the goblin story, it wasn't going to be, there was never an intent for it to be Grogger in that story, but it was going to very much, the goblins that were going to be involved as a consequence of Grogger's, what he was doing in that campaign. It was all, going to tie into that. And so when they said orcs, at first I was like, all right, that does make sense, because orcs were the things that were supposed to be invading in the first place. So we can sort of resolve some of that. But what would be the tie off, the tie into other aspects? And then I thought, there was that story in the Edge of the Abyss short stories collection as well that came out that I think I want to say it was called Kinship, where we had this whole it was the Dwarf Civil War, dwarves versus abyssal dwarves, and it involved, if I can recall correctly, there was a climax of that conflict had like this unleashing of the slave pens, the orcs just breaking loose, and so there's no explicit tie to that per se, but I just thought that's a neat way is to think about, okay, so the abyssal dwarves have this they must have this operation for their orc slaves going on, and the consequence of both as part of the chaos of an invasion and also then the flooding that finishes off the Edge of the Abyss campaign, the flooding of the abyss. Could that be the thing that unleashes? And then we're tying together those things. So yeah, there was definitely it was an easy pivot because there were things there for me to pick up to tie together these pieces of the Edge of the Abyss campaign story as I saw it. So yeah, no, I was. There was an initial feeling when the goblins, because I had what I thought was a fun idea for goblins. It was an initial disappointment, but like very quickly I thought, no, actually there's something more interesting here with the orcs, and a bit more tragic. I think people talk about like Erasmus, you were saying. I think that is what people feel about Mantic's orcs, is that they're just these mindless, violent, and there's not much going on with them. But what there is that's going on with them has a different character to the sort of Games Workshop orcs, where lean heavily into sort of comedy. There's more of a tragedy to Panathor's orcs, really, where that they have this nature, and it is awful, and their lives are awful as a result. But they're a blight on everyone else's lives, and you can sort of dig into some of that, and it makes for an interesting contrast, with the human characters and their more optimistic, desire for some treasure and things. To have that tragic contrast was interesting.
In Panathor, orcs are the embodiment of conquest. That's the thing that drives them. That's the thing that it's not about what you gain. It's not about, can I hold this land? Can I, expand my domain and my reach? It's about what's the next thing that we can conquer? What's the next tower that we can knock down? What's the next army we can defeat? What's the next thing that we can conquer? And it's a very different take from the, albeit very limited, knowledge set that I have coming from places like Games Workshop. And obviously go back into Lord of the Rings and all the other places you come across orcs, where either they're servants on, in some areas, there's a thing that leads them, that tells them what to do, or Games Workshop sort of comedic, hyper exaggerated philosophy of looking at orcs. And then you have these orcs, which they are driven by more or less a singular focus that intentionally causes internal strife and conflict within, but eternal conflict without. There is no rest. There is no taking the weekend off. It is always pushing forward to what's the next thing you can conquer. What's the next thing you can take over. Erasmus, what were your thoughts on understanding more about orcs from this book? Was it something that any insights you had on that?
Well, this book really gets into orcs, which is great. I think the big thing that's shown really well is that orcs are not evolved creatures, they're created creatures. And they were created by a very malicious entity to fight a war, basically.
I think it was in Rise of Celestians where I fully understood more about Chiron's character and how you could see Chiron splitting into the good half that is the protector, the preserver, the park ranger version. And then you have Dark Chiron, which is just conquer, take over, hunt the next thing. And I think in these orcs exemplify Dark Chiron really, really well, because it is the hunt, the eternal hunt that they're on, that you get from Dark Chiron. James, was that I don't know if you were involved in any of that, but were you playing heavily into what you understood the two perspectives of Chiron to be coming from, or kind of where did you end up with the hunting mentality from the orcs?
I don't know. I wasn't particularly thinking of the Chiron thing, but you're absolutely right that it does go into that because of the fact that I did have these these sort of ex-slave orcs, they sort of discover, I imagine them sort of as they go out and they discover hunting because they need to through necessity, that they're taking a kind of pleasure in the discovery of a thing that they hadn't known before from the lives that they've had just in the mines. And so, it definitely does lean into that because, and which makes for a nice reflection of some of the sort of hunter aspects of the mythology in the Plainsman on that narrative as well. So there's, you could almost see a sort of dark and light thing. I don't know that I would say it wasn't consciously in my mind, but those themes were certainly in there. I would agree. And it's also the thing of it was satisfying for me, I think, to give them something that they were satisfied by there with the hunt. They were gaining a kind of satisfaction from the hunt, because coming back to what you were saying as well before about the driven nature of the orcs to conquer and so on, it's very explicit in the lore that the orcs they're not really getting anything out of that in terms of a pleasure at when they conquer something. It's not, and then they destroy something. There's no pleasure per se in it. It's relief. It's that thing that stood there, that tower, say, it's symbol of order, of a society that can come together and build that and have that structure. That gives the orcs of Panathor a kind of psychic pain. And so to knock that down is to give themselves a relief from that. So, and that's, on Erasmus's point as well, these were created in a very cruel way with this urge of they're being pushed from what hurts them, constantly to try and find relief from that. So yeah, the hunt represented something that was satisfying to give them because it was satisfying for them, as I imagined it would be for these ex-slaves. Yeah.
I think it was, I don't know, maybe a third of the way through the book when I sort of formed in my brain, you have two groups that are hunting something. I put gain in the notes, but hunt is the right word. Two groups that are hunting something. You have the treasure hunters and you have the orcs, which are just hunting. That is their thing. So you have these two groups that are hunting, and that's the mirror. That's what you talked about earlier. There's the contrast between them, and neither of them really has a good idea of what will make them sated, what will give them the satisfaction in the end, because they're both just sort of hunting for that thing, the thing that's sort of at the edge of their mind that they can't really wrap their head around. The humans are probably a little bit more chill about it. They're like, hey, we have to plan, we have to set up, we got to make sure we put all the pieces in place so that we can go do this thing. And then you have Orad on the other end, who is driving his people with this idea he has, and it's sort of is he's just kind of tugging everyone else along for the ride. I don't know, believing in themselves is a thing that orcs do, but they are being pulled along by his power and his aura, whatever the thing is, in a very different way. So talk a little bit about what made you go the direction of treasure hunting with the mercenaries. I know that's probably where you started the the internal dialogue with when you were building the pieces for the story, but what made you go that way kind of in the grand scheme of things with this group of mercenaries that go out treasure hunting? What kind of pushed you that
way? The origin of the idea for that was probably as I mentioned before, this story began as a narrative sort of idea for my army's background for participating in this campaign, and that my brother was putting together, and that was going to center around a kind of treasure hunt of sorts. So that was sort of, that idea sort of was baked in from the start, but it worked for me as well because I think, I began writing this really after, not long after I'd finished my undergraduate, where a lot of what I'd been looking at was the history of particularly the Spanish in the Americas, coming to the Americas, and just the obsession with gold that was just like, we think about dwarves in these fantasy settings as having a gold, lust, but I mean, these guys could not talk about anything else in their writings. There's just gold was waiting around every corner of what they were doing. And I want to say that in some ways, some of those thoughts were probably lingering in my mind as well. I definitely toned it down, and I didn't want the claws to be as nasty as those figures were from history. But there's a dark element there, this obsession with treasure and gold, not above all else, but above a lot, and it was interesting to me to do something with that. So yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts would be on this, Erasmus, but I kind of wish you had leaned a little harder into it, because already in the book we have some good characters, but I think your driving motivation for the humans isn't a good driving motivation. It's not a we want to bring peace and prosperity to the world. It's we want to gain. We want to get treasure. We want to get a thing. Erasmus, what are your thoughts on having two sides? Obviously, one's super bad, but the other is just trying to find treasure, and you don't have a just good guy side to the conflict.
Well, I think for a start with the South American conquistadors that James just mentioned, you get, when you have a situation like that, you often find that people involved get very obsessive, because the kind of person who's involved is likely to get obsessed about that, right? Only people who really want gold become conquistadors, because that's what's in it for you. So if you have a mercenary company, by definition, everyone who's going to want to be involved is quite mercenary. So they're doing this for the money. They're at the wall for the money. Yeah, it's a cushy job and they're bored, but that's what they're there for. So offer of more money is where they need to go next. There is a sense, though, that, if we can make some money while helping people, that's great. But yeah, there are mercenaries. But they seem like they want to help. And we can get into it later in the book and how far they take that. So I'll leave the rest for the spoiler section.
Yeah. I want to jump into the book field, because I know we're going to have to get into the spoiler section before too long. So I honestly had a bit of a hard time kind of putting in my head together what the book feels like, because you have a more or less an adventure story. So you have this, we're going to go get treasure. We're going to do things. There's a bit of a heist. There's a bit of a Indiana Jones, figure out the puzzle to make the thing do the thing. There's some, journey and story along the way. And there's weird bad things happen and mystical sort of things. And then you get to a point where it does turn horror-y, and it does turn into this, everything's going really, really, really bad for everybody. How are we going to get out of this? And then there's the twists at the end. There's the pivots in the story and everything that happens. So it's really hard for me to put a singular, this is kind of how this book works. When I go back to like Pius, it's a swashbuckling book, straight up. That is what it is. If you said, I want a book that's about pirates and ships and things, that's the book you pick. If you're like, I want a book about dwarves doing stuff, great, go for Honor's Price, because that's like the core of the dwarf thing without involving politics. So there's these different books in the Tales of Panathor that are sort of, you're like, okay, I kind of pick a book that I want to go to. And this is the first horror-esque book that we have. So someone's like, I kind of like that vibe. Absolutely. Put this one in front of them first. But it's not what someone would necessarily expect if they're like, oh, it's a story about orcs and humans. So Erasmus, tell me a little bit about how you view the feel of the book and how you would describe it to someone, and then we'll kick it over to you, James, to kind of give your elevator pitch a little bit on it. What was your feel on it, Erasmus?
I feel like Indiana Jones is the right analogy. It definitely feels like, how much of actual impact the point of view character has is questionable at best, but it's this big meandering adventure that ends up in all sorts of places. And it doesn't end up where any of the characters expect. I'm not sure it ended up where James expected, to be honest. But it does get it does get a bit darker and more horror, but I think that's the nature of the villains available in Panethor and the villains chosen, which it looks like you feel that's a spoiler, so we'll leave that for the spoiler section.
James, what were your thoughts on the book feel? One, did you walk in with that intention, and two, how do you feel it ended up being in the end?
Yeah, I think you've posed a very fair question. I had a funny moment years ago when I was midway writing it and meeting up with an old friend, and they said, "So tell me what the book's about." And I just started rambling, like trying to tell them all the pieces of what this book has in it and what it's about. And I realized, as their face sort of took on a glaze, that I needed to answer this question much better in future and much more quickly. So the answer I go for is typically it is, yeah, like close to what, like Erasmus was saying, it's an adventure story. And that covers a lot. And with treasure seeking at the heart, certainly of the human narrative, at least as a motivation. But I always have to say, it's an adventure story with a lot of twists in it. And, like I mentioned before, I mean, look, I'm really, if the book ends up feeling like it's gone on so many twists that it's almost like, like I perhaps was even surprised by where it was going. I think Erasmus sort of was saying, but I mean, I have to say, look, one of the most frustrating things about writing this book for me was the fact that literally when the idea came to me, it came to me pretty fully formed. Like that entire finale of the book, shall we say, the bit where all the threads are coming together, that was just living in my head. And it was very frustrating to have that in your head and know how you got to get there. But you get very impatient, as a writer. Writing, I don't know how many other writers say this, but writing is like, when you've got a good idea and it's a good idea, or at least you believe it's a good idea, writing can be like watching the most frustratingly slow movie or reading the most frustratingly slow book ever, because you're having to write the damn book yourself to get to the really exciting bit that you want to read. And it's just, you feel like while it's in your head, there's a danger that it's going to vanish if you don't just get it out there. But no, the ending, the whole picture of it, all these threads, I just had it. I had it from the start, and I can't credit that to anything except for just phenomenal fortune, I really feel, on my part. There are many approaches that writers take to writing books. Famously, Stephen King talks about in his book on writing how he is much more of I think the term he uses is a pantser writer, because he flies by the seat of his pants. He just starts and goes, and then making the story out of it can be something you do more in the editing phase. And it's not to say this book didn't have plenty of editing happen to it, but fundamentally the whole thing, it was just in there. And the fact that it defies, to some extent, or makes difficult classification, as you're saying, Nathan, with exactly what is this book. That's just how it always was. So yeah, no, but my go-to answer is it's an adventure story with a lot of twists along the way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd agree with the general feel. Again, when you look at what are the components, what are the elements that, I don't want to say are memorable, because it's not like the other pieces aren't, but it's what are the pieces that stand out? What are the pieces that kind of sort of put it out there? Erasmus, you said it's Indiana Jones. Yeah, you have Indy, who is the humans, and then you have the Nazis, which are the orcs, and then you have this other thing that ends up at the end, and it's not what either of them was expecting, where either of them were expecting to end up. And I think there's a lot of opportunity if you're looking at a book that where the ending is, James, and you're like, how do we get there? What's the storyline to make sure you end up in the right place? It's very interesting to be reading from the other perspective of where's this story going, because I'm here and I don't know where we're going to end up. And that gives you those twists, and that gives you the shifts and the changes until you end up in the place that's like, oh, okay, this is not where I thought we were going to be from the get-go. Although admittedly, we'll talk about it in the spoiler section, there are some hints in the beginning, in the prologue, that if you read into it, even a very tiny amount, you kind of are like, okay, we're going to be dealing with some elements that are not just orcs and humans here. So that's good. I appreciate that. I hope for anyone that is not read the book up to this point, if there are questions you have about it, obviously, feel free to ask me. I'm sure when we post this, there's going to be some other questions. But this is not a book that goes the direction you think it might go, and it's not a book that is a standard, oh, the good guys ride in and save the day and do the thing. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of contrasts in characters, and there's a lot of other differences between everyone, but it's not your standard white knight shining armor kind of book. It's a very different feel for it, and I appreciate that. Very good. Any other thoughts from you, Erasmus, before we wrap up the non-spoiler section and we get into the fun and exciting part in the spoilers?
I'd say that any good adventure doesn't go entirely as you anticipate. So I feel like all the twists and turns are in keeping with the theme and feel. They're a good thing. That's how adventures are supposed to be.
Yeah, absolutely. James, anything else before we end the spoiler section and get into the non-spoiler section, into the non-spoiler section and get into the spoilers on the book?
No, all good.
Okay. Well, with that, I will once again tell everyone who has not read the book yet, this is a perfect time to pause the podcast and go get the book, read the book, and then come back for the spoiler section. Obviously, we'll take a short break, and then we will come back on the other end and jump into the spoilers. So once again, this is the big wall of don't go forward if you don't want to get the book spoiled for you. So we'll pause here and then come back on the other end.
I'm Mark Barber. I sound like a villain from the original Star Wars trilogy, and you're listening to Countercharge.
And welcome back to the Loremaster's Library. We are going to get into the spoilers section of Claws on the Plain. And again, I keep saying it time and time again. If you haven't read the book yet, now is a great time to stop and go get the book and read the book, because it's a good book, and then come back and listen to the rest of this episode so that we can get into the spoilers and you don't get some of the story spoiled for you. Because yes, this is probably more than most of the other books we have. Spoilers, I would just say, probably mean more in this book because of the twists and because of the different directions that the story goes. So don't want you to miss out on getting some of the interesting twists that everyone else got to experience. So again, pause and come back when you're ready to get the spoilers spoiled for you. If that's how that phrase kind of works. All right, so let's start off with the prologue, which normally in a prologue, I'm like, why is this here? This is just sort of the introduction and give me a little bit of insight. The prologue feels like it is a completely separate story from everything else that does tie in at the end. And I felt there's a bit of disconnect because you don't really understand what's going on. You don't really understand the circumstances. There's orcs attacking. There's these people in this town, and they're going to do this thing, and they're supposed to make sure something's safe. And then one betrays the other, and then something happens, and there's this. It turns in a very different direction because Night Stalkers get involved. And anytime Night Stalkers are involved, I feel like everything's out the window in terms of people behaving normally. So, James, I'll go to you first. Tell me a little bit about the prologue. And is this a piece that you just sort of put in to kind of guide the reader? Was this something you sort of wanted to set some of the lore up beforehand? Tell me a little bit about, because you do you do some other interjections of dreamlike story elements in the rest of the book. What made you kind of encapsulate this and put it into the prologue in particular?
So there's an idea in storytelling that you may have heard of before. I forget exactly what it's called. Whether it's called it's from I believe it's attributed to Alfred Hitchcock, and it's to do with it's either Alfred's bomb or his grenade or whatever. Where he talks about you can do a scene in two ways, where you could have a scene where these two characters come in and they sit at the table and they have a conversation, and then suddenly there's an explosion, a bomb goes off from under the table, and for the audience that's shocking, because it comes out of nowhere. The alternative way of doing the scene is you show someone plant a bomb under the table, and then you show that person leave, and then you see the other two people come in and sit and have an ordinary conversation, and then the audience is sitting in growing tension, waiting for the moment when the bomb is going to go off, as it were. So for me, that prologue kind of was a kind of bomb under the table for the story. It's like, here's this thing, and I'm planting it there in the reader's mind. You may not see how it's going to connect, but it's horror, as you were saying, it's sort of scary, and there's clues in it that are going to lead to it. I mean, the first line of the prologue says, the name of the town, Keatern, which is then going to come up in the story, and it's going to be this slowly. I was hoping it would unfold that is the ultimate destination for the story, and then it's like the reader then has in their mind something that they know that the characters perhaps don't know, or certainly the point of view characters don't know, which hopefully builds tension for what's going to happen when those forces come together. As opposed to, you can read the book without the prologue, and a prologue you should be able to read. I think prologues shouldn't be required in a sense for the narrative. They should be able to be things that are a bit extra, that you could just jump in and read from chapter 1 and you would get there, and fundamentally, nothing would change, you could argue, but that bit of tension might be missing. When things start to emerge, you're not going to have that piece of the connective tissue that grows the tension, if you see what I'm saying. So that is the sort of the idea for why, in a technical sense of the story, I wanted that in there. Also, I've enjoyed in the past, reading prologues of a similar nature in other books where you do read it and you just think, what is this? Where is this going to fit in? And it's, some readers, I can totally understand, some readers may find that frustrating, that maybe this isn't something that appeals to them. They want to know where everything's going at each point. But I enjoy it. It's for me, as a reader, I like when there's a little puzzle piece that I have to keep lodged somewhere in the back of my mind while I'm going elsewhere, and try, just try and, does it fit in here? Does that slot in there? Oh, okay. I'm getting more of a picture as I go on. So, yeah.
I think you mentioned Hitchcock's bomb. There's also a bit of Chekhov's gun with it. Like you bring the archway in, and it has to come back later, because obviously they end up going there, but you don't know that's their destination from the beginning. So you have that sort of bit in your mind of, okay, this is more than just a thing that happened once. We're gonna probably have to come back here, because if we don't, then the prologue is completely pointless. But you do have a lot of I think I reference this in the show notes later. There's a aspect of this story becoming intentionally disjointed, and I'm not a horror reader or horror watcher or anything, but I understand the intentionality of the shift in tone of the book as they move away from the big threat being the orcs that are invading to, I think, is it Savan, who stabs his friend and then goes and activates the archway and is like, okay, they're going to save us. And then you get no, this is not about saving you. This is about, you've just let something very unpleasant into your world. Tell me a little bit, Erasmus, where did you think with the prologue, kind of what were your feel and thoughts on it as it sort of kicks the book off?
It's fairly obvious that Night Stalker's involved. And as a Night Stalker player, you're immediately like, ooh, my faction is getting shown, which is something I hope all the authors realize, that if you collect an army, you really like that idea and that theme. And reading these books, everyone wants to see their army, right? Well, I assume everyone, I do. So knowing that there are Night Stalkers coming as a Night Stalker player, like, you're waiting for this thing. And obviously, if you don't enjoy horror, why are you playing Night Stalkers? Which gives the whole book, it reminds me of that scene in Jaws where they're sitting on the beach and there's only the one character that knows there might be a problem. And the audience obviously knows there's a shark in the water, but everyone else is just on the beach. And that scene where you're waiting for it. Oh, is that person swimming going to be attacked? Is that person swimming going to be attacked? Is that person drowning? No, they're playing. It's reminiscent of that scene, but drawn out. And through the whole book, the Night Stalker player is waiting for the guys to show up. Like, oh, it's a bit misty. Are we getting attacked tonight? Oh no, they've made it all the way to the town. Maybe now. and that was really fun for me. I like that sort of the dramatic tension, but also your guys are going to show up. Looking forward to it makes it that little bit more interesting. I think it's time to say about this book. It isn't clear from the cover, but if you're into more factions than you might think, get a very good show in this book. Kingdoms of Men, Night Stalkers, Ogres, Orcs. All get a really good look in. So I think that's maybe something people should advertise. If you like Night Stalkers or Ogres, something in this book for you as well.
Yeah, I think there was a the aspect of the Night Stalkers you get from this book, and it starts in the prologue, and then the very highlighted points in between. As a former Night Stalker player who didn't play Night Stalkers from just the Mantic perspective, and I say that because usually I'm a Mantic lore fanboy, but I wanted to play an army that was themed in a particular way, and it worked really well for Night Stalkers. Less on the I'm playing Night Stalkers army. I think that the average Night Stalker player should read this book and get the vibes that your army should be putting on the table. That's, to me, where I ended up. A little bit different than orcs. We're like, I understand how the orcs work. This is how you should make your opponent feel. This is the vibe you should bring to the table when you put Night Stalkers down. Know that you want your opponent to feel that overwhelming sense of dread and terror, and that all the light has gone from the world, because that's what the Night Stalkers do. That's the entire way that they operate. So it's a very different feel. It's not, oh, look at how much I understand about my people. It's like, no, you don't understand. You won't understand. So make your opponent feel that. Make your opponent get that sense of dread that was leaned in there. James, did you have a history of playing Night Stalkers, or was this because I know you mentioned Kingdoms of Men was your thing? Was this like your brother was playing Night Stalkers and you wanted to make sure you leaned into that? What happened there?
No, I now have in my ever-growing pile a Night Stalkers army that is waiting its turn, but no, it's just an army that, immediately in even before we had the models, back when that first Uncharted Empires came out, I felt like most of the, I think we all knew where Mantic were going with this, what they were aiming for is, or at least I really felt like it's like, okay, we're doing something here that is Lovecraftian. There's no avoiding that word, but it is also leaning into visually these, and that's become more clear as they've, produced this fantastic model line for them. We've got aspects of sort of the alien aesthetic and all of these things. So, it just felt right that the Night Stalkers, the whole thing should be that they are just terror incarnate. They've got this relationship with dreams, so there's got to be a kind of insubstantial quality to it, which, like what is the scary thing about nightmares, or one of the scariest things about nightmares is just the unpredictability of them, and the fact that they sort of break the normal laws of how things should be. Even though often we'll when we're in those dream states, we'll roll with that kind of thing. And then when we reflect on it afterwards, you'll think that was kind of strange. Why was I so scared of that? But it's because it's not actually the thing itself. There's just there's a feeling, as you say, that goes along with it. There's a dread that pervades through the idea of it all. And, so, no, to answer your question, no, I don't collect them yet, or rather I don't play them yet, but, that idea, that theme, of them would seem very clear to me as how to go with it, and it was very fun to write, very very interesting.
I think there's a very, I put in the notes, it's the setup to a horror movie, the prologue, and I think you touched on this, Erasmus, with Jaws, of that first kill, that first body that gets dropped that you feel is disconnected. It's not a part of the main story, but it's that piece that sets up the main story. It's that, the first time a person gets killed, and it is in this story, it is setting up the grander, the set piece where we end, but also it's setting up the Night Stalkers for who they are. And I felt it was a very clear cut this is the Night Stalker vibe that we're going for. And I thought you hit pretty much what I always expected Night Stalkers to be really well, James. So good on you for not being a player of Night Stalkers, but still hitting that vibe and hitting the dread and terror aspect of it, while still, like, there didn't have to be anything physical for the character to feel that much terror. There were no one directly stalking them. It's completely in their mind. It's completely in the voices that they hear and the creepy childlike laughter, like all the things that are just like, oh, that's not good. If I was in a dark cave, I wouldn't want to hear that at all. So yeah, setting that up was really good. Erasmus, any other thoughts on the prologue from you?
Yeah, I agree with you on the first kill thing, where, again, back to Jaws, that set up at the very beginning where there's that girl on the beach that gets pulled back and forth famously. It does sort of have that vibe, the monster's been unleashed.
Hey, Abyssals are in there too. Abyssals are in there, probably less than some of the other books, but there's a pretty good vibe from them too. So we'll get into them at the end.
That surprised me, but yes.
Yeah, that was one of the big pivots. All right, so let's jump into. It's kind of hard to say exactly where. This is part of how my brain works. My brain just sort of puts the story in this big, long string, and I'm probably going to get some things out of order in talking about it. But at the beginning of the book, we have, was it the gambling setup and the conversations among the claws about what are we going to do next? Kind of what's this thing that, because one, we're bored. We don't really like just hanging out here at the wall and playing guard duty. And then obviously that transitions them into, well, now you don't have a job. So them having the desire and the drive to go get some treasure and then getting that opportunity presented to them. We talked about this a little bit in the non-spoiler section. The claws aren't really good guys. I think you pointed out that they're a bit like conquistadors and that they want gold. It's not as bad, but they want to find the next job. They want to find the next thing that lets them continue to do what they do. And from the get-go all the way through the end of the book, they're mercenaries. They're never these superhero people that are supposed to do good. They're out there for themselves and trying to get as many of them home as they possibly can. Erasmus, what are your thoughts on these characters being, again, not in that good category and sort of just on their own as mercenaries? Because I don't think we've had a focus on the humans, the quote unquote good.
They definitely strike me as neutral, but maybe leaning towards the good end. Because as mercenaries, they're somewhat amoral. Like, their job is killing people for money. Even if those people are other soldiers, but they do want to do things in a way that if they can help people, then they will. But that's not the priority. Like, that's not the job.
When I'm looking at the mercenaries and when we talk about the protagonists, it's, and I think we mentioned this earlier in the non-spoiler stuff, the idea of protagonists being not really quote unquote good guys is a very interesting take, because it sets up a lot of, to me, internal conflict. But James, I don't feel like there was a lot of internal conflict within the claws, because they all believe in their leader so very much. This isn't a group of loosely connected people. This is a group of mercenaries that have a well-defined leader who is, I mean, he's front and cover. He's on the cover of the book, front and center. He's the guy. He's the person they follow, the silver cat. He has a mythos almost about him that you don't usually get in most of the heroes that we have in the other books. There's not a, here are the good guys and they're led by a person that already has a whole lot of clout, that already has his people on board. They're sort of having to put their people together throughout the story and make sure that everyone knows they're a good leader. Was that just a direction that you felt was necessary? Did you have this really cool idea for, Dargent as an existing leader, or did you want to just say, hey, no, we're going to skip past the part where he's got to build the faith of his people because he's already got that? Why would we need to spend a whole lot of time on that component, James? What were your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a story this is a Claus story, but this isn't their origin story. I definitely wanted them to feel more like, more like pulpy characters, where you can just jump on in with them pretty much, anywhere along the line of their adventures, if you imagine, and here we are somewhere in the middle, say, who knows, it would be the idea. And that, so that hopefully the sense, I obviously in my mind have a lot of the sense of what that background looks like, what that future might look like, but that is just a sense that I want to impart to the reader. You want to feel like you're just joining in with these characters. They are going on an adventure. They have this dynamic that will set up, that has been set up between who they kind of are. You've got Uzlo Dargent, this grandiose figure, because, and I wanted to make, rather than just being like a cookie cutter, like typical mercenary group that you might find anywhere in Panafor, I wanted there to be a bit of character to them as a group as well. They're kind of oddballs, really, for the amount of belief they have in their leader, for the kind of person he is. He definitely, we've talked about, I don't want to make too much of the comparison to the sort of the Conquistador thing, because while, they do have, that was definitely an element in my mind while I was constructing all this, really the treasure for Uzlo in the way I was thinking about him is much less to do with the treasure concretely in it of itself. It's the glory of finding the treasure. It's the doing the thing. It's the succeeding of going out and making that name and spreading that name and sharing that with his men. He has the other oddball aspect that I tried to make clear in the book as well. That this whole thing of him being a general, but he's a general of this comparatively quite small organization. I mean, but he gets to pick his own title, so why wouldn't he just choose general? It's and the claws don't just take on anyone. They take on particular characters. If Uzlo Dargent doesn't feel like he vibes with you, then if he senses something a bit off with your character, he's not interested. So he's got this group of people who I think, as Erasmus said, that look. And in fact, one of the nice things I think about fourth edition from a lore perspective is we are moving away from these good, neutral, evil classifications, but that they think of themselves certainly as good, and they would think of themselves as there'd be nothing wrong with pursuing glory within these certain things. They like the idea of them of doing things that are good while also serving themselves. I'm not denying that they are definitely looking for personal glory, and wealth would be nice on top of it, but they're supposed to be a slightly odd organization in that way. They're probably looked on as a bit strange by other mercenary groups. You have a more professional, you might say, mercenary group in the Dragon's Teeth, who are also stationed at the wall as a kind of comparison that's meant to be there. And Uzlo flies by the seat of his pants a bit as far as all these things. He gives it into his whims while also having a very calculating mind. But then you've got characters like Zavir, who is more pragmatic, who definitely believes in him, but has to anchor to some degree of reality and pragmatism some of his grander visions. And you just want to jump in with those dynamics. And then in the best tradition, coming around to what I was saying again about these being like kind of pulpy characters. If you think of the great pulpy characters like Conan or whatever, these characters don't change hugely over the course of their adventures in terms of their core person. They are kind of stable, and they move through their world, and we are shown parts of their world around them. And really, the stories of some of these pulp characters are often the individual stories are more the stories of the people around them, and they're just the through thread of consistency. Though they do, there is development, and you always want some degree of movement in these characters. But this is definitely there's not. It's an interesting thing. Some story people think that characters must always go on arcs, in their stories, or not must, but that's seen as a very important thing to do. But you could argue there isn't a huge personal arc for each of these individual characters in the clause. They definitely are changed by things, but fundamentally they are still themselves at the other end of this adventure, and they as I say, I think they think of themselves as generally gooder guys than a lot of you'd find out there. But maybe from our perspective, that doesn't count for much when they're putting so much value on personal glory and treasure and so on. But it's also appealing. I think there's something that appeals to a lot of us in that, and going out there and into the wilds sort of adventure mentality.
I think it sets up a different perspective from the reader's point of view when you have I'll say protagonist lead, because in my opinion, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, this story is mainly told from Xavier's point of view. That's a lot of the story is his perspective. There are other elements you get some of the story brought in, but a lot of it's surrounding him more than some of the characters. And you see Uslo as he's that archetypal, as you said, pulpy adventure hero, where he's larger than life. He has a lot going on. He has these plans. He has these things. And then the plans together, and he turns his beard and says, okay, well, you figure out the details. I'm going to go do some stuff and I'll come back. And you get why his people follow him. You understand that. And at the same time, they're all like, well, okay, we've got to sort of work around this idea he has. We have to sort of figure out how it pieces together. And it fits in that pulpy feel, because all of his main people have their specialty. You have, okay, I kind of do the infantry, I do the archers, we have the cavalry, we have these pieces sort of work together, and we have all sort of figured out how to operate within the circle that is Uslo's charm and charisma and aura and all the things that he has. And so these very capable, very competent people that you mentioned are if they aren't good and they don't vibe with him, then they're not going to be a part of the clause, especially as leaders. So it's very interesting to have in the back of our minds, a concept of, okay, cool. What if there was a different book that was the clause in a different scenario, the clause in this scenario or that scenario, another story from them. And obviously, James, you may or may not ever go that route, but it'd be fun to see, okay, what are some other stories about these folks that we could bring them in and have them be that maybe a recurring theme, a recurring character group of different stories in different locations. I think that's a great place that we could see them again, or references to them again in other stories, because they have that, I don't want to say timeless, but almost timeless quality of they could be anywhere at any time, given that they're mercenaries and they could be there to help people and be there to, gain some money and do their next thing. And what do you know? They blow their money. I'll blow their money on gambling and alcohol before they have to go do more money to get more money to do gambling and alcohol. So Erasmus, what were your thoughts on the characters in the clause and sort of how they integrate at the beginning of the book into that overall kind of the overall scheme of how things worked?
I think it's worth saying at this point that while a real world mercenary is, well, quite mercenary, they're not generally good people. Their job is to go kill people for money. When you're in a fantasy world, though, one of the great things about fantasy, it lets you embody the ideal. It lets you romanticize the thing you're talking about. So you can have good at heart mercenaries who are out to do good things. Because firstly, there's lots of fighting that is not killing people. There are orcs and goblins and undead to fight. So you can romanticize things a bit. Like, that's what makes fantasy fun, right? So it is nice to have a sort of noble at heart, but he's still running a business leader. Like, if I could be helping people all day, I do that, except I have bills to pay. And I think I touch on this every podcast, but that's one of the joys of fantasy, is you can actually embody the ideal and romanticize something that in the real world might be problematic.
Yeah, and I would definitely say, that an inspiration that I'm probably just realizing in myself in a large way for these clause characters as well, and frankly, their attire, I'm now realizing that it's outrageous what I've done without realizing it. But Firefly, the TV show, Joss Whedon's Firefly, those kind of characters, very much there's an element of that in there as well. They've got to just survive. They're not causing events; they're living under events. They've got to survive, but the captain has a heart of gold really under all that, and he would like to do the right thing. He would like to find a way to both get the money and do the right thing if he can. And they wear long brown coats as well. Whoops, sorry, Joss Whedon. Hashtag not sorry, but
Nothing wrong with that, man. As a person who absolutely loved Firefly, I do appreciate you mentioning that, because you do have these. They're not confined roles. So I think that's the both in Firefly and in something like this, where you have these various characters that have a role that they play. Oh, I'm the guy over the crossbows. I'm the guy over the spears. I'm the guy over the horses. And they have that interaction, that dialogue, and the back and forth, and how they interact at a tactical level in combat. And everyone's got their job, and they know their job, and they're going to do it. But the interactions that they have and how they push and nudge their leader to making other decisions and doing other things, it's a very fun concept to have a group of people be the protagonist. Yeah, sure, there's like the person at the top, but it's really about that group of people. And that's why having Xavier be a foremost perspective in that group is interesting, because it's not Uslow's perspective. It's not everything focused around him. You're seeing him through the lens of the other characters, and the grandioseness, the charisma that he has. It's not him talking himself up in the first person. It's everyone else and what they see of him. And you as the reader understand more about how they view him than perhaps really who he is.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get the mistakes that he makes and the stumbles that he has, because you're viewing it through the eyes of people who are loyal to him, almost to a fault, who will follow him into complete danger and hell and nightmares because they believe in him, because of their experiences with him up to that point.
Yeah.
So it's what's the untrustworthy narrator, what's the word for it in writing, they're not really untrustworthy. They're not unreliable.
He has a bias. Yeah.
Yeah, they're biased, but they're biased because of their experience with this other character. So it's not his perspective where he's telling you the wrong thing. It's how they view him and how they understand him to be. And that's what you get as the reader, which is a really fun way to approach it. In my opinion, I think it's a great way for you to experience this, again, sort of mythical leader character in their eyes. Whereas people that are outside of the closet are like, okay, you're just kind of a ragtag group of people and you call yourself general, and that really doesn't matter. But all of his people are like, no, you don't understand. Like, you don't get it. He's really, really, really good. And no one else really seems to see the same thing. So it's a cool way to see it. Erasmus, let's just wrap on the beginning setup with humans and kind of where we're at in Darvled's town. Any other thoughts? We'll probably get more into the Artivikians and the quote unquote Vix as they're called. Any insights from you on that beginning setup and how the town works and everything there before we jump onto the orcs here in just a moment?
I found the town quite interesting because a lot of towns start that way. Like the typical example is a gold rush town. Like there's something here that generates money, so people flock to it. This is not a gold rush town. This is a military-based town, which is also realistic. Real world armies often had almost a town of people just following them because soldiers get paid and they need to spend it on something. So I thought the town itself was interesting. And as angry as it can make me, for good reasons, literature-wise, having the sort of exploited refugee dynamic, it's unfortunately not unrealistic. But it did set up a good sort of conflict tension and a reason for the story to make sense. So I think that is well done. Even if that gets my emotions going sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. I think and I called it out as the way that they're treated in my head is very realistic. And so it's almost like a side piece to what the mercenaries want to do. You get that heart of gold and they're like, oh, we're going to go do this thing. We also have the opportunity to help these people that are really, in a bad spot, and everyone has put them in this bad place of, well, you can't leave, you can't go home, and while you're here, we're going to make you do stuff because, of course, we've protected you, we've taken care of you, we're going to treat you like slaves. That's bad. That's really not a good thing. And so you have some characters that show, hey, we're the good guys, but we're going to be good guys while we're doing the thing that takes care of us. So it's like a side piece that we could just add on. Yeah, sure, we'll help you out while we're doing this other thing, because we'll take advantage of you, you take advantage of us, and everyone ends up happy in the end. So good call out. I appreciate that. And that is it's obviously a main part of the story. Let's jump into the orcs. Again, this is the first time we've really had orcs in a book from their perspective. So for me, Orad being this ex-slave, having all this inner angst and rage and wanting to go and conquer and having this big vision and who he's going to be and all of this, setting him up from this very small group of orcs comparatively, and he's about to go on the plains and have to build up his army and do his thing. And you see that journey, you see the story of him getting there, having a vision of something greater, not just I want to amass power, but I have a thing to do. It's the age of the orc. It's we will conquer everybody. We will take over. Erasmus, what were your thoughts on getting this insight from an orc who is a little bit different, but also how he has to interact and bring all the other orcs onto his side? Talk to me a little bit about how you felt there.
So again, it was really nice to get more on the orcs and really get the sense that, either pick a leader and follow him, or be the leader and go conquer and destroy, because you can't help it. That's your drive. That was maliciously put into you. I did find the sort of the honor, might is right culture is inherently very judgmental. So you're constantly having to prove yourself. Like, if you want to be the leader, then you have to constantly prove that you're the strongest. And if you want to take something over, you have to prove that you're stronger than them. And any reason to judge someone as below you gives you more power. So any excuse to go, oh, they were born as slaves, therefore it's my right to take theirs. I'm stronger because they couldn't possibly. I think that constant having to prove yourself and be the strongest, we saw it in Pius as well. Mm-hmm. But that sort of, I think, like James called it, a tragic life where this is just how it works for them because that's their nature. And you feel sorry for them to an extent because it's this brutal life where they're constantly having to fight to have what they have. I thought that was interesting look in. And also, well, that's how they work, and it explains a lot of what they do.
Having a group of my group, having an entire race, species, whatever it is, in Panathor being built around might is right, it's not a simplistic thing when you look at all the other factions and how they work. We've talked a lot about goblins and how surviving is might. Like, if you live, then you're better than if you are strong. So if you can scrape one more day, just get one more, survive one more thing, then you're better than everybody else. That's kind of how their mentality works. And, dwarves, where the clan is everything, and to lead the clan, you have to be thinking about what's good for the clan, and everyone has to recognize you're the one that we believe is going to do the right thing. And you go to orcs, where it's just who's the strongest, who's the best, who's going to do the most killing, who do we believe can let us do the most killing. It's a very different take on sort of just the setup for a group of them. And it works really well, in my opinion, because they're the foil to everybody else. They're the only group that really works like that. Everyone else has their own way of handling things. So it makes them very non-human, because that's not how humans tend to work. Sure, we may think that the strongest has some right, but they're not going to make the best decisions. We all know that the person with the biggest muscles doesn't necessarily have the best ideas. Doesn't mean they can't, but it means we have to evaluate you based on what are your leadership qualities, not can you just kill the other big leader in battle. So, James, where were you coming from with setting up the orcs and putting a lot of these pieces down? Was this information that was handed to you by Mantic as to here's how they have to work? Or were you allowed to sort of build some more pieces in there and expand the lore around orcs in a way that you felt was best appropriate for the story and also best appropriate for the characters you
had? So I would say for the most part, and I definitely don't recommend this to other writers, but my attitude was more the ask for forgiveness rather than permission when it came to adding stuff in. So, but I didn't add a huge amount. Mostly it was just picking up on what was put down by Mantic in the first place. Like they told me go with orcs, and then I looked at, okay, well, what were the orcs doing? The orcs that had done the initial invasion in the Edge of the Abyss campaign, what were they doing? They had this character Grumtongue, who was talking about a prophecy, and the Age of Orcs was like in that little short bit of narrative there that came up as an expression that the orcs were chanting. So there was this religious sort of prophecy element, very vague, but it was in there. And obviously then we know that didn't go well in the actual campaign, and so therefore in the narrative that didn't go well at all. So it's like, well, what's next? Is there any fallout from that? Is there anything you can pick up in there? And is there a true prophecy now to be fulfilled? Was that just prophecy deferred rather than anything else, or at least in the minds of the orcs? There's always going to be someone who will come in and think, just as I'm the strongest, it's like, actually, no, that was me. That was meant for me to do, and I'm going to prove that was meant for me. Yeah, and then as far as, shaping out the honor culture and all these sort of things that the orcs have got, I've not read a lot of Brandon Sanderson, but I'm aware of his idea of, you go deep rather than going wide. So there's a few things there with the orcs. You've got this honor, you've got this psychic drive to destroy, to relieve themselves from the pain of order and civilization. And you've got this idea of cannibalizing their opponents, And so just bear down on all that. And, what you end up with is this culture, where there's going to be a lot of ritualized dueling, even if it's only vaguely ritualized, in the simplest terms. There's got to be some sort of structure around that so that people then will recognize that it's not just going to be dueling to the nth degree. There's got to be some element in these duels as well where, like, the manner in which you put down your opponent, is in the crudge that we have between the Blood Tusk and Orad to establish dominance. Orad realizes he could just go in for a very quick kill, but he gets much more out of a more impressive kill, which almost costs him everything. But he's got to really show just how much he can dominate this fight. And then as far as the other idea of why I approach it from the perspective of these escaped slave orcs as the main point of view is I thought it'd be an interesting way of having the reader take on the point of view of orcs that would then mean that the actual orcs that they encounter, the sort of freeborn orcs, would seem a bit alien even to those other orcs. You're now introducing certain ideas to this orc character that he didn't know about, and he's had to learn on the fly. Life was different, and perhaps even, some of the order of just being a slave would change the nature of the lives of those slave orcs. So, like, some of this is unfamiliar to them, even though it's been built on sort of their instincts that have been put there. And so he has to learn that, and so the reader can then learn that through these characters. So that was the sort of the technical idea of why I wanted to approach it from that perspective.
I think it's interesting to have on both sides, you have characters that don't have any trust or built-in automatic trust in each other. So even on the orc side, you have Orad and you have, what is it, Bolorm? If I butcher somebody's name, my apologies, Bolorm.
Yeah.
And you could tell from the beginning, Bolorm is he's gunning for the leadership position, but he knows he can't take that. He can't control that. So they're coming out of being slaves, and obviously the other orcs don't trust them, don't recognize their value because they're ex-slaves. So there's distrust between the ex-slave and the quote unquote free orcs. And on the human side, you have the lack of trust between the Artivicians and the Southerners, and then even a little bit with Aaliyah, the Easterners, and the various groups that don't trust each other. But then you come back to this ironclad, we're going to trust each other no matter what, which is Uslo and his counterparts, his subordinates that are directly under him. And there is immediate trust. There's built in, because of what you said on the kind of the pulpy factor, where it's automatically there. And the contrast between the two sides really is just in those main leadership groups, where there's a whole lot of distrust everywhere else, but you see the one side that has, we have this centralized group of people that really do work well together and trust each other, versus you're constantly having to kill every other leader you come across in order to gain some semblance of trust for their people. And at the end of the day, Orad knows, hey, I've got to kill off a whole bunch of my people that aren't really good, so that we just have the really good fighters that get there. So part of their journey across the plane is, get rid of the weak ones, whether it's through eating them or they die in combat, whatever it happens to be. So there's a lot to be learned. Again, Rasmus, you keep bringing this up. If you're an orc player, there's a lot to be learned about the culture of the orcs in this. Tell me something, Erasmus, about the orc culture. I know we've mentioned a few things. Was there anything that particularly jumped out at you as sort of now if someone is like, hey, I want to play orcs, what it's about them, Erasmus, what would you tell them now that we know more based on this story about orc cultures, kind of to sell them on how that works?
I think the big thing that comes through here is the sort of the wicked design of how the orcs were made. So they can't stand civilization, which means they can't build, they can't farm, they can't settle, which means the only way to feed themselves is to take from someone else, which means they have it in them that they just have to keep conquering and taking and raiding and destroying, which makes them a great weapon, which was the plan. But this whole to be an orc means, fight or starve, because you can't farm. Your creator has made you that way, which is tragic, but it also really explains just keep fighting.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Good elevator pitch to somebody for orcs. All right, let's shift over to the kind of moving the story forward a little bit with what I termed the heist. So here's where we've got the claws. They're trying to get out of their current situation, go get treasure, go do their next thing, move their own adventure forward. And they have the opportunity in the end to take a supply train that they think is just a standard supply train that's going through the town to go to Darvlad's army. And they're like, well, we could steal this and then we could go and get treasure because we'll have tons of supplies. Let's go ahead and do that. And then the complexity amplifies. And here's where I think it's that interesting, not really Ocean's 11, but the idea of Ocean's 11 of, okay, here's our goal. Well, then suddenly you have a whole new problem thrown on top of that makes it more complex, which is, well, there's a whole lot of Artivicians we've got to deal with. Oh, and now there's ogres, and there's this entirely different group of guards, and we just don't have jobs anymore, so we can't really back out of this because we don't have anything else. Okay, we have to overcommit. We have to do this thing. James, tell me, or I guess we'll go back to you, Erasmus, real quick. With this entire sort of component of the heist and getting the wagon train and sort of up until they're out on the plains, what was for you, what was interesting about the story? Kind of what are the pieces you liked about how the intricacies of that little plot worked out?
I really enjoyed the bit with the lower part of the wall because of bureaucracy. Having worked for a large company, that kind of thing happens a lot, and bad decisions because that's the plan. Follow my instructions to the letter. Can say it amused me, because I've worked for people who do things like that. As to I think heist is the right term. That sort of, here's our plan, and the solution to each problem makes a new problem until eventually everything comes together. That's always fun. Like, heist movies are popular for a reason. So I quite enjoyed that.
James, what about you? Was this a walking in, we're gonna have a heist, or was this sort of a piece that you brought into the story just to kind of fill in and make a thing happen? Kind of where were you coming from the story from with the heist aspect?
I mean, from the beginning, as I say, all the pieces just were there at once, and so there was always just, it had to be a heist. I mean, how else were they going to do this? As to how I'm saying all the pieces were there. The broad structure of the story was all there, and certain things were there in very vivid detail. But the actual specifics of the heist itself, yeah, that came much more as I got to it. Like, I had to kind of come back and revise it, and that definitely didn't land fully formed. And so there was always, there had to be some sort of heist, and it's like, okay, I like the odd heist movie. I know a bit, but I'm not. It's not like a genre I'm super familiar with and into. So it was then, how do they pull off this little scheme, and working all that out took a bit of doing. But actually, for all that I'm saying that, it did more or less, once you get the first few pieces in place, there's a domino effect. Okay, well, if this happens, then this has to happen, and what's the complicating factor here? Okay. And you just have to, at those moments, you just have to roll with it and find out where you end up. And fortunately, it came together pretty much. I'm just trying to. I'm hesitating. I'm trying to think if there was anything that was really changed there in editing. No, I think it pretty much all just sort of came together with those pieces. Yeah.
Nice. No, it's I wondered because it felt like the story was set up with the heist, and knowing you had it. Okay, there's going to be a heist. This is how it's going to work. But then how you had to sort of put the pieces together in the story was ended up in a really fun space, because you see the problems and you're trying to work out, okay, well, problem A actually solves problem B. Well, problem B we have to solve with something else. So there's something else we have to figure out. And so it's the various pieces and how they connect. And you don't spend 500 pages trying to break the thing out. You just say, hey, here's these scenarios, here's these pieces, and then you kind of get that Uslo magic, sort of, which is why his people believe in him. Is kind of like, oh no, this is all going to work. See, he's just make sure that all the bits are connected with the support of his people, who are really good at doing the thing. It's you mentioned earlier, Firefly. It's the Malcolm Reynolds magic of, oh well, everything's just going to work out because here's how this is going to happen. So it's a fun space for it to be. All right, Rasmus, I'm going to ask you the same thing I asked earlier about orcs, except this time it's going to be about ogres, because we get introduced to the ogres that are connected to the wagon train, and Uslo has a conversation, or a lengthy conversation, with its leader. And there's a lot more insight about ogres in this book than we've ever had before. So, Erasmus, what's your words from this book to the wannabe ogre player?
I was very tempted to start an ogre army after reading. And you really get there's a lot of other books you have an ogre, because there are mercenaries all over the show. Here, having ogres plus families plus a little bit of a view into their domestic lives is just a lot more than we've seen. But I also found it they're similar but not sort of take. Where they're ogres and their culture is different and they think differently, but they also have teenagers who act out. All right. They also have families to take care of. The only reason they're not refugees is because they're mercenaries. So, but on this job, they have to bring their families along, which ups the stakes. Which means they need this job as much as anyone has ever needed a job because they have nowhere else to go because they haven't been flooded. And I really enjoyed the sort of conversation on the wall. For the insight of like, this ogre has problems with his kid. But also the whole, I'm making a connection with this person, but I also need something from them. That was fun to read, but I enjoyed just the insight into this ogre's life, especially as someone who has a child giving me some difficulty myself.
I thought it was very interesting in the conversation that Uslo has with, and I've completely forgotten the leader's name. I was going to look up real quick. That they're having this conversation on the wall, and how disconnected they are in terms of culturally and values that they hold, but they're having a conversation, and at the end, the ogre leader just sort of gives them some advice, and then there's this weird moment of, okay, well, now I have a problem. Our culture doesn't give people advice. You're like, what? How does that work? Because if it's not asked for, then you're just telling someone something to do. It's sort of you're a bit of a taboo thing that this ogre leader has done, but he's only done it because he has this connection to Uslo, and they're sort of connected a bit in these conversations. Then he's like, okay, well, I've given you advice, so if you don't give me advice back, then we have a really bad balance between us. And it's the mental cultural ledger that they have of, I've given you something, now you have to give me something, or I owe you something. And that is part of what's, at least how I viewed it, ingrained into their culture, ingrained into their values, almost from a biological level of the ledger, the balance that they have to maintain. And it goes further into, when they tell the ogres, oh, go chase them down. They've raided the wagon train. Go chase them down. The ogre leader's like, yeah, sure, absolutely. How much? Like, how much are you going to pay us now? Because that's not our job. Our job, we're being paid this much to do this job. You're asking us to do this much more, and we're not being paid that much. So you gotta give us the money to do that extra thing. And obviously the complexities with humans, and that's not the way it works. It's like, we're already paying you to do a job. You may as well just do this now. Just go ahead and add it on. And the ogres are like, but no, that's not how we work. How we work is this way. And we're being paid by not you, by someone else to do the thing that we're doing. So we're just going to keep doing that. And the humans not understanding how ogres work. And basically that gives the Silver Claws the chance to get away. It gives them the opportunity to finish their heist because the other humans just didn't understand and weren't willing to, or weren't able to, increase the bargain, increase the job for the ogres that little bit. Was also really insightful. So James, tell me a little bit about how you ended up with ogres, kind of like with orcs, how you ended up here. Was this heavily planned by you, or were you sort of kind of working through a lot of this as it was being written?
Yeah, no, I think again in the original plan, it just made sense for, you've got to just complicate things for your characters. I think it becomes it's not fun to read if things just go well. It can be very tempting when you're attached to your characters. You just want to make everything work out for them, but you've got to put them through hell, really. And so you needed a big complicating factor before this heist that we've been talking about. And, what could be more complicating than, on the morning of when they were going to do it that night, just suddenly an ogre tribe rolls over the hill that they had no idea was coming. And now they've got to roll with that. And also, the link was obviously there in the lore anyway. The wall was, being manned at various points by ogres. So it made sense for them to come into the story in some form. And again, coming back to the edge of the abyss, ending with this flood water that stopped the expansion of the abyss, but passed over the ogre lands beforehand. And that was obviously, that is in the lore that was treated, but in a way, it's wonderful. A slight side topic. It's really great how Mantic are moving on the story of the world, and it is fantastic. It keeps all of us who really love this world and this game engaged with where the story's going. And the last thing you want is sort of the state that some of these other companies end up in, where things are just always, whether or not they're 2 minutes to midnight, they're just stuck for a very long time with no movement, or they'll move it forward and then reset it backwards because actually we preferred it sort of on this precipice back here. So it's great it moves on, but it does mean, like, and this is a good problem to have, I would say, is that there's so much like rich potential for stories that kind of just can get left behind by moving onwards, and that's a good thing. It means, people can come back and look at these things and say, what happened here? And so it's a bit like, well, we're told that the floods going over the Ogre lands was devastating. We're told that the Ogres made this great sacrifice to allow this to happen in the council so that the abyss could be slowed. But then we haven't really seen the consequences in the time jump. The time jump takes us to the waters have evaporated. The Ogre lands are back to being sort of, they're recovering. So it's like, well, what happens in between? What were some of the consequences? And I thought this would be an interesting idea, is, that now it's not just the warrior bands of ogres that are going out and being hired as mercenaries, but it's rather the whole entire ogre tribes are now displaced for a period across the continent and are having to just, find a way to survive. Whether, who knows what other ogre tribes might have gotten up to that might have been, because there might have been more nefarious things, or maybe they didn't get hired by anyone in other ogre tribes. But this ogre tribe gets a really great opportunity, obviously, to just come and set up at the wall, which just made sense for them. I thought so. Yeah.
The cultural aspects of ogres being so alien to humans, and seeing them show up, and everybody knows, oh, okay, this changes how things work. And then obviously we get sort of the tag along ogre into the expedition moving forward, based on from what you mentioned, Erasmus, with the conflict, the parent child conflict that they have. You could have like ignored all of that and just been like, hey, they have an ogre as part of the mercenary group, and it's just already there. But having it start from a complexity, adding another character in, that becomes very important in the overall story with how things are handled, and sort of what the journey ends up being for them was really fun. I had a good time seeing the ogres get introduced, and I know there will be more ogres in future. We'll see more ogres in many other roles, I'm sure, with some more books that are coming out. So good. Any other last thoughts on this portion of the story before we move the story ahead to, well, moving sort of the orcs up a little bit, and then obviously the humans as they start getting more into the journey itself?
I'd like to give a quick shout out to I suppose, the moral of the story, where if you put some effort in, you can probably find some common ground, no matter how different and alien the culture is of someone else. And they were both mercenaries, and they had things in common there. And that gave them advantage over the people who couldn't be bothered to talk to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Young, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Uslo spoke at least some of the ogre tongue. Is that right?
Yeah, he had he had a little bit to work with, and then he was just having to wing it, from there. But that just often, just having that little bit to start from and making the effort,
Mm-hmm.
as Rasmus says, that can do a lot, to just immediately start to build a bridge there to work on. It shows, the level of respect to start with. Yeah.
Yeah, he had respect, he had understanding, he'd done the research in advance. Again, as that pulpy character of course he's got ogre in his backstory somewhere. It's a language he's unlocked a little bit, and he knows some about their culture because of course he needs to, in case he runs into a situation like this. It's that, that tool that he just so happens to have that he carried along. Which works really well because, again, he's this sort of mythical character from his people's perspective that just so happens to have this thing, and he's able to make that connection. And he doesn't, as you mentioned, Erasmus, he doesn't do it or he doesn't make that connection because he already has everything. He's risking some, and he's putting himself out there, and he's saying, hey, maybe I can make this connection. And if he'd offended them, if he'd gone a different route, yeah, maybe the ogres are like, sure, fine, we'll do this thing because we don't like this guy. we'll go hunt him down for you. But is that he's extending himself. He's being the more or less good guy. Again, he's in that not really quote unquote white, shining armor sort of white knight. He's in that gray area, but his gray area is try to build allies, try to help get everyone on your side, because it'll work out better in the end if you do that. Do a good thing because it's going to help you and kind of advance your storyline in that pulpy way. So really good. No, it's good insights from you. All right, let's talk a little bit more about orcs, because we're going to kind of bounce back and forth as the story does between the two sides. And you mentioned earlier, Erasmus, tearing down the tower with the attack that they make on the castle, keep, little town, whatever it was, the sort of fortified thing that they have. It's sort of their first real conquest. I thought it was very interesting that we get the orcs. We introduce the don't want to get too graphic on things necessarily, but we have a lady orc who obviously is attached to Orad. And so we understand now how orc biology works, because there's some fun conversations we had about goblins, and that's weird. But orcs are very much, normal reproductive things. And we meet female orcs and the interactions they have. And then she dies, and Orad's just like, okay, we're still moving. And you understand that there's not love, there's not connection, there's not anything remotely human in their interactions from a emotional understanding. But you see, okay, there's this additional piece of orc lore that gets unlocked. She dies, as I believe that's part of the attack on the tower. But you also have the tower attack, which is this completely different perspective on how orcs handle things, which is super tactical. They're in their element, or at least Orad is in his element, in planning how we're going to take this walled, fortified, heavily equipped thing. We're going to build a catapult. We're going to huck these explosive things that we happen to bring with us, because, of course, I thought to bring those along. And I already have the place surrounded. I have my people waiting to kill their messengers so they don't get out, so that nobody knows, and we can do this job. So you see the advanced tactical thinking of the orcs, because that does kind of lean into their character normally, but it's also Orad. He's doing it a bit differently. He is a bit of a different character in that he brought more or less a catapult with explosives along with him for exactly this kind of thing. So Erasmus, again, more pieces unlocked on the orc side. What were your thoughts on the attack on the tower and kind of the setup, the story that surrounded that process?
It's worth noting here that orcs they're not dumb per se. Like, war is what they do, and they do it well. And again, that hint of tragedy of, if they could stand built up things, maybe they could build something, but that's not how they were made or what they were made for. So that's not the life they get to lead. I will add that Lady Orcs was a surprise for me. My money was on getting pulled out of pits like Urukai. And how many Lady Orcs are there then? Because I don't see any models or any characters. Or can humans just not tell them apart?
James, where'd you come from with all that?
I don't have an absolute certain answer to that, but I would suspect it is the latter. It's the idea that really they're physically indistinguishable for the most part. Like orcs would know, but orcs would have to. I think there is. I forget where. I think there is some suggestion somewhere that the orcs did have to be taught this thing. That while clearly they have the capacity, and it was so to some degree built into them, the instinct wasn't built in the same way, and so that's to some degree had to be carried perhaps by culture. Again, but it's all very vague, and I mean literally. What happened with this was early on in the process, I asked Mantic, what's the deal with orcs? Where do orcs come from? And it was, what I got back was there are female orcs, and not much really, nothing much more than that. And it's clear it's not something that they're interested, or at the time that they were interested in really bearing down on or exploring too deeply. I would imagine it's quite probable they have a lot of ideas about that, and it's just would be a question of when and how they want to deploy those, but if ever. But so I kept it pretty vague as well. I mean, the suggestion beyond what's in there, all that's there is what's in there. But in my mind, it's the idea that they're very similar in aspect. So when you're seeing orcs, you are seeing a mix of male and female orcs. And then I just introduced this idea of, regardless of who rises to the top, there's then becomes, and it could be, who's to say, a male, female Crudgers, there then becomes a battle as to who has the sort of pairing right with that one at the top. And that's basically all I've added to that. The actual anything about the mechanics or what their instincts are or anything, it still remains to be explored, and is quite vague. But yes, certainly your comment earlier, Nathan, about there's not a huge amount of connection forged in all of that. It is definitely something I was wanting to sort of put across. The idea that it's sort of fundamentally having a partner that he does very much strokes Orod's ego, because she's such an impressive, strong orc. But once she is killed, it's like, well, clearly not as impressive as I thought, and that's it.
It's very interesting to not have a there's no romance potential even in their culture. This isn't something like, ooh, someone could take a weird side tangent and make a romantasy orc thing. It doesn't exist. It's physically not how they work. They are biologically not going to go that direction. Sure, there are reproduction, but that exists entirely separate from any sort of emotional capacity, because I don't think there is emotional capacity in orcs. They were not created with that ability to have that connection. And so you can't even feel sad or sorry. I guess you can from the human perspective, but from their perspective, it's just, moving on to the next thing, because that's the constant grind of the orc. It is, what's the next thing to conquer? What's the next thing to kill? What's the next person I can bring along that has strength, et cetera, et cetera. It's just kind of looped in all together. And a part of that overall part of the story. Were you writing, and again, I could particularly go back to the attack on the tower town thing, whatever that first sort of thing that they get, with the orcs having a little bit of internal conflict, but was this just Orod proving he has the chops to do what he needs to do, James, or is this sort of just expanding the kind of the drive for them moving forward? Kind of what was and not saying what was the purpose of this, because it obviously has some purpose, but sort of in your mind as the author, was this one of those set pieces you knew was going to happen, and you're like, hey, I've got to kind of give Orod some juice to get him to that next level?
Yeah, this was, so why this scene happened was basically, as I mentioned earlier, sort of third edition dropped when I was, I want to say, over halfway through writing the book. And we got these gorgeous maps that were so much more detailed than we'd seen before. And one of the maps of that region showed beyond the river that had been shown there before, that I'd already had them sort of amassing at, and that was already sort of locked in, were these guard forts, as they're called, this network of fortifications. We don't really, to my knowledge, there's not much more said about them than just their sort of appearance on the map. There might have been something I've missed in later years, but certainly I thought, okay, so like that sort of necessitated them to pass through that. And it was like, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to have them sneak through past that line of watchtowers, of defensive positions? Yeah, that was a possibility. But, really, this is an opportunity for Orod to show his orcs. It's another test for him to prove himself in a way. He's proved himself in the duel to become Crudger, and he's amassed this huge army. What's he going to do with it? What's he actually going to be like as a leader in battle when he's faced with, these things that cause psychic pain, as we've talked about to the orcs? And it's also it's also something for the reader as well. It's, you've got to, if the orcs are ultimately going to be the antagonists of the claws, and you hope by this point that your readers are attached to the claws, you want them to be a little scared of what's going to happen when the orcs eventually hit the claws. So you've got to take every opportunity that's given to you to really show them to be the scary force that they are, and put the fear perhaps in the reader a little bit as to what might come later. So yeah, that was the idea of the scene, and also showing, that while Orod is a physically impressive specimen, he is a mentally impressive specimen as well. He has had foresight. He has learned. These are. I think it'll be no surprise to you when I say these are essentially Angkor mortar shells. Was the idea that he has stolen from while he escaped from Tragar, and he'll have seen them perhaps from a distance that are being used. Perhaps I mean, it's a bit mysterious, but it's possible that some of Orod's time as a slave was as a slave working battle. Most of it, really, I say much more is in the mines. But he knows what this is. He knows its destructive power. And he had the foresight to think that could come in handy later. And then, of course, he has the goblins that he's captured, which is the last, I should say, coming back to earlier, like the goblins being in the novel, that bit with the captured goblins is sort of one of the last sort of pieces of the original idea that's sort of carried through, is those goblins being in there. And he has them build a catapult for him. And yes, it shows those ideas as well of orc culture, because again, I think that's been established, I believe, in sort of Pious as well, like orcs for more sophisticated technology have to, outsource some of that to goblins who are very handy with that sort of thing. So it's making use of that idea, also showing, his foresight and his thinking, and the ability of the ex-slaves, who, as we talked about before as well, have become hunters. It's Berlirim who's surrounded the fort to make sure none of the messengers escape with word of their arrival, and it's showing off there that these sort of skulks are particularly impressive. Skulks of they're with these skills that they've honed out near the Howling Peaks.
I think with the surrounding skulks and them waiting for the messengers to come out, and you also get I think you mentioned earlier, Erasmus, or maybe it was you, James, the cannibalistic tendencies of their sort of, oh, okay, we know their fight's done, because you hear them now just feasting on the bodies. That that pivot from, oh, we're fighting, to, oh, now that's done, now we're eating all the bodies, and the amount of terror that have to produce to the people that are inside the town, to know they're not taking prisoners. Orcs don't take prisoners. They're not going to, haul you away somewhere and sell you as slaves. If you're not dead, they're going to kill you. And when they're killing you, they're going to eat you. And that's how it works. So it raises the scare factor for orcs significantly above just, this is an enemy that's going to defeat us. It's, no one's going to be alive at the end of this. There's going to be nothing left of us. And it amplifies their kind of the danger that everybody's in, including, as you mentioned, James, the claws and where we know they're going to be. All right, let's move this story up a little bit into the town that they run across, where we sort of get the first real introduction into the Night Stalkers. So the group of Archividians and the claws arrive at, and my brain just completely forgot what's the name of the little town.
Kadala, I think.
Yeah, and they get there, and it's just dead. That's why I refer to it as this dead town. There's nothing there. There's nobody there, and they're sort of holed up. And then obviously there's this additional group of bandits, bad people, that are going to kill them, and if they don't hand over sort of the thing that's the guide, the person that's gonna take them where they need to be, because of course Uslo is planning all this, but someone else told somebody else who now has information that they're treasure hunting and that there's treasure, and these folks want to take it for themselves. And then everything goes really, really bad for, well, everyone else. So I think the introduction of the Night Stalkers into this component was really interesting, because you also have the first time Xavier has, I don't know what to call it, the vision, sort of premonitions, connection that he has to the Night Stalkers, and the terror that sort of comes along with that. And then you have Aaliyah, who we haven't really talked to a lot about it up to this point, sort of showing off that she's not just a person, that there's something else that she's got that's going on. There's a lot of introduction of new things in this story, just in this one sort of set piece bit here. But even then, the conflict that we have inside that town, it's not a lot of the other stories. You get the nice setup of, oh, okay, this unit was here and this unit was here and they charged and this happened. But the whole conflict feels very disconnected and bits and pieces here and there, because a lot of it is from Zavir's perspective, sort of, and you can tell he's more or less out of it. There's a lot going on, and he is not going to be able to retell that part of the story very clearly. So it's this really interesting connection to the Night Stalkers coming in, the terror that comes with that, and the fact that, you know, this is just normal happenings with people trying to rip off other people. So tell me a little bit, Erasmus, about this part of the story where we first get that Night Stalker introduction, and just how much that kind of pivots the story for everybody.
Well, as we alluded to before, this is something that's, you know, it's coming, it's been hinted at, and you're sort of waiting for the moment. You're waiting for the moment the shock arrives. You're waiting, you know, like, is it now? Oh, it's coming, it's closer, and then something happens off screen, you don't see them this time. You're like, okay, almost. And that whole lead up through the book, I really enjoyed. And this is just the next, like, it's the sort of the false peak in the storyline of tension. So I obviously enjoyed that. The other bandits, I wasn't expecting. I was expecting Night Stalkers right away. But having the teaser, for lack of a better word, is good writing. So well done.
Thank you.
James, tell us a little bit about kind of the introduction of this, but more importantly, I think for me, the connection with Zavir and kind of what's going on there from your perspective as the author. What was happening?
Coming back to like what we, you know, the Night Stalkers and what we think of with the Night Stalkers and when they were introduced and how they were introduced, and it's this connection to dreams and to the minds of the observer. There's almost, dare I say, a quantum element to them. You know, they are affected by the minds that are present. I mean, we see this in the rules. They've got, you know, their entire rules, they steal inspiring from their opponent's army. It's about the observer effect is taking part in Night Stalkers, and which basically allowed me the opportunity to have a thought, well, what if maybe, you know, there are minds that are just more sensitive to their presence. You know, it could be vanishingly rare, but, you know, just the possibility of someone having a sensitivity, nothing much more than that they could do with it, but it might give them certain insights at key moments that are probably too late to be ultimately helpful, you know, unless you've got someone there like Alia who can, you know, pull something out of the bag with knowledge that she has. And, you know, this idea as well of like, I think I say something about like at one point she says something about like children being particularly susceptible to it, which just made sense to me as an idea because, you know, kids and night terrors and nightmares and as an idea with these things in the closet and so on. But so yeah, no, basically with Zavir, I mean, I have ideas about why, perhaps, whether it's just you know, just sheer chance or whether there's something in his background or his family lineage or whatever. I have ideas, but I'm hesitant to say because, again, it's like what's in the book is what's in the book, and anything that I have as a thought about it is not canon. It's literally, it's a bizarre situation because I obviously am the author, but it's fan fiction. It's not in the book, even coming from me. So, you know, there's a range of possibilities, shall I say, but ultimately what it comes to is he has a sensitivity. And so when Sivan ineptly opens the portal, the idea is that, you know, that leakage of the sort of energy of Night Stalkers from their sort of space between that they exist in, their void, sort of sets off things that can be lost. I mean, you know, just usual dreams or nightmares, you might just dismiss them, but as it gets closer, as, you know, to the source, it becomes stronger, it becomes, you know, more invasive to his conscious mind. And that was the sort of idea. And that allowed, again, coming back to what Erasmus was saying with tension, I mean, like, you know, the tension is ultimately what I was going for with all this. I'm just turning that dial as best I can to try and keep the reader's attention, but also, keep them on their toes as far as what's going to come. And I thought that was another fun tool to play with there. And ultimately, obviously, as I've said as well, the whole idea for the entire finale of the novel as well, especially, was already in my head. So I wanted this dream sequence parallel. We're skipping ahead slightly. I won't go too far into it, but I wanted that basically in the finale. So I needed to have some build up into that and to choose my characters and to think about how that's going to lead in. So it's not just coming out of nowhere, for the reader, that there's something that they are rewarded with from having paid attention to these pieces that develop.
You mentioned that the Night Stalkers and they leaked in from Sivan opening the portal, and that was in my head. I said there's a direct connection between the two because they've come in there, even though this is a different location. There's also the and I don't remember how explicit you were in the book. Perhaps it was very explicit, and that's why it's in my head. That they're drawn to the conflict, sort of they're the ravens circling the battlefield. Because there's the conflict between the humans, the bandit raider people, and then the Claws and the Artivikians. There's this engagement, this conflict, this discord between the humans internally, and they're sort of drawn a bit to that. And you see it again with the conflict between the humans and the orcs, and they're in my head, they're the sort of balancing factor in some capacity with the world. Because you have the abyss that would love to conquer and take over, and obviously all the quote unquote good people that want to not have themselves be conquered and do the good thing, and yay. And Night Stalkers are not either. They're otherworldly. They're that eldritch sort of horror thing on the other side of the portal that once they're let in, they're drawn to that conflict, and they don't care what side you're on. They're not going to make an alliance. They're not going to talk with you. There is no balance there. They're the all-consuming terror that sort of waits in the darkness. And then you set up in this book, those two sides. You got the quote-unquote good people, and you have the abyssals who are trying to do the bad thing. And then you have these two more or less neutral factors in the humans and the orcs. And they're not really neutral, but they're there, and they're having their own conflict. And then you just have the Night Stalkers kind of wrap the entire thing. They're the overarching terror that kind of just sits there, and obviously is the largest threat. They're not the only threat, but they are the largest threat in the end. So it's here's where you really get the Night Stalker vibes, and you see units. You can pick out, oh hey, this is we're seeing scarecrows, we're seeing these, and you get those little pieces in the description of what these things are. And I thought it was a really good way to introduce the Night Stalker player into, hey, here's the thing that you do. Here's the units that you bring to the table, and here's what they're supposed to make everybody feel. So as our resident Night Stalker player, Erasmus, any other thoughts from you on their introduction here, and how that worked from your perspective?
It was still quite vague at this point. Like you don't actually see them. They're off screen in the mist. So you're cranking the dial up to 7, not 10 just yet, which builds that suspense because, you've almost seen them and they're almost there, but it's not quite there. And I think we'll get into the details when they actually show up a bit later in the plot.
And to me, the fact that they rescue, their arrival kills all of the raiders, and they're the rescuing force to these people that are holed up in the town that can't leave. They're going to starve to death if they don't get out of there. And then the mist comes and destroys the thing that's threatening them. But at the same time, the mist, the things in the mist are the real danger. They're the thing that you actually have to worry about. And it advances the story a few steps more. Just kind of moves it ahead to, well, we're going to have to deal with that. But for right now, we can keep moving. And it was a little bit, to me, a surprise that there wasn't more of an in-depth conversation. And again, goes back to the pulpy fact of it, James, that there wasn't a conversation where Ursula had to rally everyone and say, no, we're still going to do this. Because in his mind, this wasn't you don't need to have those conversations. So we're still going forward. We're still doing our thing. And everyone's still on board. Everyone's still pushing in that direction.
Yeah, they're gamblers, and they got lucky as they see it. And it's like, well, sometimes you don't question your luck. You just take the win and roll on. And we've, perhaps seen stranger things. Probably not, but they've seen some strange things probably in their time. And maybe the way to survive in Panathor is to just roll with the punches and, take the win, as they would say. And, it's this thing as well. I wanted, as you correctly say, they were basically saved from an impossible situation, ironically, by the Night Stalkers appearing. But obviously then the irony is doubled down on when, they defeat later on they overcome the orcs in the battle in Caitern, and then the Night Stalkers appear then and sort of save the last remnant of orcs, you might argue. It kind of reverses the situation on them suddenly. They got lucky that time, but not so lucky the next time. And just turning out that down. And I would say as well, on this bit about with the appearance of these bandits that attack them, and definitely there was a misdirect there in terms of having them appear out of the mist. And at first you might think, is this the Night Stalkers appearing? But no, it's just, again, we're just turning that dial in tension. But that was also, that was a piece of the story that there was a version of this book that was a bit bigger, that had Uzlo going away and doing what he was doing in that period when he went away, and had much more direct connection to these bandits that are wearing Darvlad's uniform forces and explaining them a bit more. But there, it was clear that things needed to be sort of pulled out of the manuscript, and rather than making the decision to change that bit to make them more generic bandits, to remove those connective tissues, I decided to just push that part of the story off screen, as it were, and hopefully it still comes through that connectivity is still there. It says they're there as a consequence of all of this stuff that's happened, but they're shocking now because they, rather than before, they were a bit of a bomb of them unto themselves. These bandits that were then suddenly on the Claws trail, but in this version, the final version, it's more of that shock version. You don't see the grenade, and it just goes off, and they're there, which kind of was pleasing in one sense for me as well. But hopefully that connectivity was still present for the reader.
To me, the connectivity with them being ex-Darvlad people was, and maybe this is me reading into it more just from myself, that I see Darvlad as a villain who is out for personal gain and out for his own glory and out for his own thing. And we see his comeuppance a bit with Broken Alliance. We see some connection back to him there. But he doesn't have the loyalty and trust of the people that work for him. And here you see the side effect of that, in that there are these bandits, these raiders that are still wearing his colors, and they're obviously not working for him, and they don't care about him. They don't care about his cause. They don't care about the thing he's trying to do. And I agree. I don't think it was necessary to have a lot of buildup there, but you have this off-screen thing that is Darvlad over off to the side, and these are an after effect of that. So there's sort of the vestigial remnants of Darvlad's impact on humans, and that, well, the bad humans, the quote-unquote evil humans, are the ones that worked with Darvlad. They're the ones that everyone views as the not good characters, which I think lines up pretty well with where, at least I'm hoping everybody views Darvlad to be. He's not some hero of humans. He's
exactly
himself.
Yeah. No, good. Yeah.
All right. Any other last thoughts, Erasmus, before we move into the convergence of everyone and the final pieces to the story with Caitern?
Other than that, I hope no one other than himself thinks Darvlad is a good guy. Let's get into it.
All right. If anyone thinks Darvlad's a good guy, we can fight in the comments. How about that? All right. Let's get into Caitern. So up until Caitern, we have the beginning of the book mentions it, and then no one says where they're going until they get there, until they get to this valley that I kind of think I had a picture of what it was. And then like every time someone's describing it, I'm like, oh, there's more, there's something more. There's a different aspect. It looks different than I thought it would. So it's like this evolution of the place from everyone's perspective, which is a fun way to do things. But Kiatern, as a dead town, they walk in and it's just empty, and you get to the other side and it's death. There's like chaos and destruction has happened, and the orcs were there, but not just orcs. Like there's something else going on because there's no bodies, there's no bones, there's nothing, and there's not evidence that a lot of people were killed. And so it's this bit of a creepy mystery, Silent Hill-esque sort of, you don't know what happened here, but you know it was bad. Well, now we're all here. What are we going to do next? And the conflict internally that sort of brings out between the Artivicians and the claws, and where the Artivicians eventually end up moving forward. And they're just like, no, we're gonna leave here. They make the smart decision, which is we're gonna get out and we're not gonna be here when the bad things happen. Admittedly, they didn't know the bad things were gonna happen. But you have the sort of the setup and the presentation of the place and the various aspects, the historical factor. But there's also at the same time the other part of the story that's going on at this point, which is Arlok starts his pivot onto where Arlok ends up being. And you also have Elias suddenly disappearing. And there's these components that you've kind of seen floating, the mystery and there's going to be something happening, but you're not sure what. And there's questions unanswered. And those pieces start unraveling. So the story itself just starts going in its different directions. Some of those directions are pushing in towards Kiatern. Some of those are pulling away from Kiatern. And there's a whole lot of just pivoting that occurs right in this space in the story. So Erasmus, I know we've kind of alluded and hinted at it, but what were your thoughts in the kind of that setup of the final bit to the story with all those changes and all the little bits that are twisting?
Very telling with how the story is written and how it's sort of an adventure where the actual important thing that's going on is kind of happening on the side from the reader's point of view. And once the actual protagonist and antagonist are doing their thing, everyone else is just left in chaos to figure out what they're going to do. Because in the story, there's more about ogres than you might think, and Night Stalkers, and orcs, and kings of men. It's actually Basileia versus the Abyss, which surprised me a little bit, but it all boils down to Abyssals and Basileans fighting and manipulating everyone else to get to their situation, and everyone else is just along for the ride, which feels very Indiana Jones, right? So I enjoyed that. But I was surprised when Abyssals, okay, that makes sense, but I wasn't expecting it until it came.
You have some pretty good threads from Arlok that there's definitely more going on than Arlok wanted Orad to know, because he kills the other God Speaker, because the God Speaker's like, hold on, you're not, and then he's just like, yeah, I know, you're dead. So there's other things going on with Arlok, but again, you don't have any clear insight because Arlok is not a main character that is willing to describe to the reader what their point of view is. Just like Alia is not going to describe to the Claws what her objective is. So you have these characters that are intentionally shrouded in mystery, and you get to the point of their conflict at the end. And you're like, oh, okay, there's this other thing going on. And all the characters, everybody else that's been here, as you mentioned, Erasmus, is just a side character. All the people you thought were side characters were really the main point, and all the main characters were now just trying to struggle to survive at the end of the book. And it shifts the entire perspective around. So, yeah, I liked it. James, is that pivot sort of, because I know you mentioned this is sort of all of the threads you knew and kind of had laid out. What was different about this part, or is it still in that same, yep, no, this is exactly how I intended it to be? Was it difficult getting to this space as the author? Kind of let us have some insight from your end.
Yeah, again, and I hope I don't sound like I'm praising myself or something on this, but it's just, this is what I envisioned from the start, the way this book ends, and it really didn't change hugely at all. Trying to think what changes there might have been. But no, I think pretty much, and the frustration, the most frustrating part of writing the book was trying to get there, because I was so excited to get there, because I had such a clear vision of all the pieces coming together. So it was always the idea that this was ultimately, just an extension of that massive conflict between the Shining Ones and the Wicked Ones, just reaching right across the continent to where you think, this is all just distant. This is all just in the east. This is between the Brotherhood. This is between Basileia. But no, it's here as well, because, this conflict has tendrils that just, go far and wide. And the idea of this story being a kind of interlinking of many stories, or that there are many stories layered on top of one another, and we just happen to view the story in the main, we're viewing this story from the perspective of sort of the claws and the orcs. That's the level that we see it. So some of those other pieces of the story will intersect with that. We'll get glimpses into it, but that's the level of if you imagine it, of like the strata that we're focused on, the line that we're moving along. But you could change the perspective of the story. You could retell this novel from the perspective entirely of Alia, and it becomes a very different story. And the claws are characters in that story, but it's a very different story, and it would start in a different place, and it might even end in a different place. Similarly, you could do the same thing with Notgrag, although Notgrag's story is her own thing going on, really. And this is really like a kind of a side quest that she ends up on, this whole thing. That idea for me was important coming to it, that for everyone, the stories are never going to just be these clean things that have a clear start point, a clear end point, and a perspective that encompasses it all, for the most part. I mean, you can do that, that's fine. But for what interests me is the idea of, stories are always intersecting with one another. Everyone is the central character in their own story, and we just choose a point of perspective to see it from, and follow that thread.
So I'm hearing you say, James, is that if you have an idea as an author, you can just write that idea, and no one's ever going to edit it or modify it, and it's just going to end up perfectly exactly the way you envisioned it.
It has to. Yeah, you have to be very lucky. I mean, you also have to be an absolute chancer. I should say again, in the rules of that I have learned, that people should definitely not copy me and not do this. I'll confess that Brandon didn't know about the abyssal twist either. It was never included in my proposal to Mantic.
Wow.
Even though it was in my head, which is outrageous, and no one listening should ever do that. But literally, I just thought it was such a good idea. I was so pleased with the idea, and I did not. And sometimes, I feel like a twist in a story. If you sit and watch The Sixth Sense, that twist, and you don't know what the twist is, and then you see that twist, there's a reason it had an effect on the culture, that's a known twist. It's powerful when you see it in the context of that movie. When someone tells you the twist and you've not seen the movie, you're like, all right, and it's never going to be the same. So, it's not a good thing. I don't think anyone else should do it. But, my fear is that if I say I've got this twist, and actually this character is this character and this character is that character, then it's like trying to describe a painting without actually showing someone the complete painting. I wanted it to be, and so, unfortunately, this did lead to some moments in the editing process where Brandon was literally, like, what, where is this all going? And it's like, just keep going. And thankfully, when he got to that twist, he said, okay, yeah, I did not see that twist coming, but it works, and we're happy with it, which is good, because if they hadn't been, it would have been, there would have been no way around that. But it worked. And, the thing you hope for as a writer with a twist is, there's a thing they say about twists should always be unexpected at the moment when they're revealed, but they should, in retrospect, feel inevitable. So hopefully, if you've placed enough of the threads, enough of the clues along the way, you can look back and see, oh, okay, that feels inevitable. That feels like I see now how the manipulation was going through the story. But in the moment, yes, the author just wants to surprise everyone. So yeah.
I'd liken it to, and I've a big fan of, well, not all mystery writers, but Agatha Christie as a mystery writer, where you get to the end and you just, for the life of you, you have no idea who did the murder. Usually it's a murder. Who murdered the person? You have no idea. And then the detective just lays it out and says, well, if you saw this piece and this piece and this piece and this piece and this piece, and you saw all those pieces, everyone saw those pieces. There's no hidden information. There's nothing that really isn't known. It's just, do you have the ability to put those seemingly disparate pieces together to form that whole picture? And as the reader, yeah, you kind of like, yeah, there's something weird going on with Arlok. Aaliyah's like, what is going on? There's stuff here, but you don't know if you're just going to be left with mystery or if that's going to tie back in. And then you tie them back in together. It's like, okay, both of the mysteries are intricately connected to that one single piece at the end. So those little, boxes of unknown are actually the same box. They're the same thing. And it's that conflict, the eternal conflict between the shining ones and the wicked ones. That was really fun. And again, it's the backdrop to the end of the book is the point. It's the main storyline in the book. You just don't know it. And you haven't known it up to that point. Let's talk a little bit about the actual battle. And I'm always hesitant because we don't want to spend 20 minutes just saying battle, did this, did that, did this. Erasmus, what were your thoughts with, because the battle itself is extremely hectic. There's a lot of chaos. There's no clear set battle lines and people in glorious charges. And the conflict is very different than Pride of a King and Broken Alliance and the other books that we've talked about where you have, oh, I hit this guy here and did this and did that. And you get some pieces, or it's very tactical of, oh, I saw these guys move this way. And then this unit went this way. It's in the thick of it. It's quick flashes of combat. It's, cutting back and forth between characters. So Erasmus, tell me a little bit about the battles there at the end. What were pieces you liked or questions you had about what was going on?
I think the thing I dislike the most about battles in any story is when they're vague and the detail is sort of left out. And then they charge and they fought for this long, and then, this guy fought and that happened. But anytime the tactics actually described and the positions are described, that's the most satisfying battle for me, which we get here. Because it's an urban fight, urban battles are always chaotic and messy and terrible, even more so in the modern world. But this whole lead the orcs along into a trap, that was well described. What was going on. It's often battle descriptions get so chaotic that you don't actually know what's happening. But here it was always clear, okay, the orcs are being led, you know what's happening. But because it's urban and it's an ambush, it's very chaotic. But that fits the theme where everyone else has been left in chaos while the Bissels and the Basileans do that, while Basilean does their thing. There is a quote about ambushes where which I'm paraphrasing, if an ambush is discovered, then you can do more damage to the ambusher by discovering the ambush and ambushing the ambush than the ambush could do, which is what makes them so risky. In this case, the orcs don't discover the ambush, but because you're busy ambushing and you're all split up, when the Night Stalkers arrive, they're effectively ambushing the ambush and everyone's all over the place, which makes it that much worse. And it makes the chaos of the ambush becomes even worse because the Night Stalkers just appear from everywhere, right? And they're almost always ambushing. And I felt like it was well described, even though it's chaotic, and it's supposed to be chaotic because that's what the situation is, right?
It's a very, with what you said with the ambushers being ambushed and the consequences, it was very good to have from the human perspective that very fleeting moment of, yay, the ambush worked. We flooded the orcs into the whatever trap, we broke the barrier, let the water in, sweep them all out. yeah, we'd killed a lot before then, but really a lot of the work is down to using the water to get rid of the orcs completely. And you have that moment of, okay, cool, we won, we did it. And then immediately after that, it's like, oh no, we didn't. Zavir's down, and that means that the bad things are coming. What do we do? How do we, we got to panic. And that's, again, it's very much throughout the book that you're sort of going from one piece to another piece, and the claws have a direction that they're trying to go, but at the same time, there's never they don't get to make a lot of choices in terms of when they get to do things. They're, oh, we're going to do the treasure hunt. We're going to do the thing. We have this supply train coming. Cool. Well, no, we can't. We just got fired. And now we have to deal with this problem. Oh, we went to this town, maybe get a brief rest. No, we're getting attacked. And no, there's Night Stalkers. So it's this constant nudging them along where they have an objective they're trying to get to, but they don't get to control the pace of getting there, in my opinion. And you feel that way, I think, as the reader of James, you didn't spend 30 pages writing about the journey from point A to point B. You're like, okay, they're going here. And the next thing is, okay, we're here. We're hitting those points in the journey where it matters and where we understand what's going on. And the kind of the pieces in between don't matter. And you get to the end and it's just constant trickle of step to step to step to step to step, kind of moving, forcing the story along with the various things that come along. So it's a very, very interesting take on it. In terms of writing the battle, James, was this something that came easy to you, or it was pretty difficult? Because I've had different authors say different things about how writing conflict and writing battles works in their head, and then trying to get it into print.
Yeah, I'd probably say it's one of the trickier things because you're moving into a space where I, as a reader, I'm very aware that I think, like what Erasmus was saying, I think as well, I relate to that because it's like certain battle scenes can really lose me, where it just feels like you've just gone into a list of things rather than, anything that I can actually visualize or that I can really viscerally see going on. And so, I wanted, in the book, I wanted to make sure whenever there was an action scene, for the most part, or any kind of conflict or fight, that it always felt like the stakes were there, and that it always felt visceral, and that it felt like you could see this unfold, each blow, each movement, or at least the important ones, and that you weren't just having scenes where, it's fine to have a scene if you want to establish a character is badass and have them just kill a bunch of lackeys or something to establish that they're that badass. But do it quickly, please, because once it's established that there is no threat to this badass character, it quickly loses its interest, or at least I lose interest in just getting the detailed description of dispatching each of these lackeys. So, you've got to blow through that. And then anything else you give me has got to have some impact. So that was the difficult thing, really, was I always was very aware as I was writing it that it's like, because of how I read battles, this is the danger area for losing my reader. If I wander off a little bit, then their eyes might just start to glaze over, and then what's the point, So that was a thing that was just in my mind as I was writing it. So I was just trying to make sure that it was always something to grab onto, that there was something that felt like it had stakes, that was worth sticking with, rather than just descriptions of things that aren't actually, that don't carry risk or that don't feel impactful in the moment to moment of the novel.
Oh, good. And I think you end up there. I think there's as you said, oftentimes you'll get, this person kills this guy and moves to this guy. From the humans, you don't really get that. You get it a little bit from Orad, but even then, there's not a lot of time spent because you already know what his capabilities are. You already set him up as being this person. He's able to blend through, some humans that have spears pretty easily because he's used to killing other, very strong orcs to take their leadership position. So there wasn't a whole lot of necessary walk through the specific details of the battle, and you could describe the battle in a very different way. And also just elevating the story into it not being about the battles. It's about what all the other things that are going on, the other pieces that are there. I thought there was basically when they get to backed into the chapel and the Night Stalkers are surrounding them, you get that horror moment of, well, we have enough time to catch our breath, and then the hand breaks through the window. The moment of now it shifts again and we have to run again. I thought the plinth setup was a really good setup where, we're just going to kind of poke around with this, have our Indiana Jones moment for Uslo to figure out how to open this door and figure out how to get to whatever's beneath the chapel. Because even then, he's still hunting treasure. He doesn't know what he's doing. He has no idea, no plan, but he's just kind of poking around at it. And then that becomes their measure of safety, because the chapel very quickly becomes not safe. And so there's these advancing pieces. You bring those story elements back in, which I appreciated. And that lets us get down to really the finale of the book, which is underground. We get down into the darkness where everyone's running and everyone's doing everything, and you have two characters that are in, again, sort of dreamlike state. So Erasmus, kind of walk me through your perspective or your thoughts as we get through the end of that last part of the battle, and the Abyssals coming out and doing their thing, and then the conflict with the Night Stalkers down in the darkness, and then Aaliyah. Kind of walk me through what you thought and how you felt about everything.
So I'll add that the Abyssals versus Basilean fight is a fun fight to read. It is interesting. Abyssals and Basileans aren't my point of interest per se. I'm the Night Stalker player, so I cared more about the Night Stalkers. Which is not to say that the Abyssal and Basilean stuff was bad. It's just not, it was not the character that I was interested in following, but it was well done. And even though it was the most significant event in terms of the world and effect on the game or story world, it wasn't what we as readers were invested in, because we cared more about the claws, right? Which is a fun way to do it. I think we've already covered this all. And as for the Night Stalkers, it was nice seeing different Night Stalkers to the one other book. A little bit of a pity about the Spectres, though, because they've been taken out of the game. But it's fun to see Night Stalkers that are slightly different to what we've seen before. It's fun to see how they work. The whole everything's turned upside down and normal rules don't apply with Night Stalkers was fun to see. Where just might of arms isn't how you beat them. Someone's going to be scared in the ranks, and it's just going to make them stronger. The more you fight, the more you struggle, the worse it gets. You have to go do the dream or magic thing to get rid of them. That's what you need to do. You need to be brave. You need to go deal with your dreams. Just fighting them is not going to help. Which is the way they should feel. And as a Night Stalker player, I was very satisfied with how that worked out. There's a story somewhere. I think it was in the second edition rules, where there was a town beset by Night Stalkers, and everything just got worse and worse and worse. And eventually someone decided, glorious last charge, let's go. And just the act of courage just dispelled the whole thing. And that sort of feeling and that sort of this is more about psychic things and dreams and all of that than just might of arms. I think that feeling and theme with the Night Stalkers really came through well. So I enjoyed all that quite a lot.
I think there was the conflict around the chapel where soul flayers come through, and you get the bolts that are coming from the specters and the phantoms, which you see outside. There's these different elements, and the humans are reacting to them the entire time. It's back up, get back, get safe. It's the Night Stalkers doing what Night Stalkers do best, and then you see the Night Stalkers engaging the Abyssals, and the Abyssals don't have the same fear response. There's not the same ability, I think, for the Night Stalkers to take as much advantage. Plus, you have Alia, who's trying to fight them as well. And not that she doesn't care, but she's strong enough and capable enough that she's able to move through that. But even Nokrag was a great. It's hard to explain how you feel that would work, and then you read Nokrag explaining trying to aim at the Night Stalkers, and it's just like you can't. Like you really, really have to try to. If she tries to aim her crossbow at the Night Stalkers, and it's just not wanting to go there. And the idea of stealthy from them isn't that you can't see us. It's really hard to look at us. It's really hard to point your weapon physically in our direction because the amount of fear that you feel, even for someone who is, an ogre and obviously very strong and powerful. So a good way, James, to give us those insights, again, unlocking more about what these different groups are in just those moments. Any thoughts from you, James, on those conflicts and that additional information, those additional pieces as we're sort of wrapping up the big pieces of the story?
Yeah, just exactly. I mean, you picked up what I was trying to put down there with the stealthy thing, the idea that it's it can be at times, maybe they are in mist and they're difficult to see, but also isn't it interesting, the idea that their presence just makes them difficult, as you say, to look at, and the fact as well that, or the idea, I should say, that we've talked about, where they sort of exist in the mind of the perceiver, and that the dreamlike quality. And how many times are you in a dream where you're trying to run away from something, but your legs suddenly are feel like concrete, and it's just not working like it should work, and you aim at them, and for some reason your mind just can't find purchase on what you're trying to aim at. It suddenly doesn't seem to be in a single spot to aim at anymore. Yeah, that was a sort of idea I was aiming for, and that's great that came across. The other thing was writing the sequence around the portal with when the Night Stalkers pour through and start fighting the Abyssals. I mean, that was just a lot of fun to do, especially at the time. Again, so I'm trying to place the timeline of all this of when I was writing things, but I'm pretty sure Vanguard had already come out at that point, and I'd gone big into that with my brother and was playing Vanguard, and we had Night Stalkers and we had Abyssals, and there was a scenario in the book that was the battle, that was capture the portal and whatnot, and that had all been planned beforehand. But it was just such a wonderful thing to think, okay, so this is like an actual, this is a Vanguard battle, actually, not even a Kings of War mass battle. We're having now a kind of skirmish, and so that means we've got to have a mind screech come through and start actually throwing lightning and all this, and and again, none of these. It was important to me as a very slight tangent, but it was important. I felt that in describing the Night Stalkers and in portraying them, that I didn't call them Night Stalkers, A, and B, didn't call them by their individual types, because these things really are not quantified. As far as my understanding is, they're really not quantified, except perhaps by some extremely specialist knowledge in the world of Panethor. So they're not going to have names that are universally attributable, and where they are named, they're going to be named based on their description. So it's fine if you want to call something a spectre because it's spectral. You have to establish that to the reader, and then have that organically emerge in the perspective of whoever's viewing them, that this is something I can think of as a spectre because it's spectral or what have you. And so, yeah, that was fun. What the thrust of what I'm saying there is that what was fun about that is that instead of then having to just rely on saying, and then a mind screech appeared from the portal, you have to describe the mind screech and the wonderful mantic model that is just so full of character and so terrifying if you actually saw one in real life. So that was really good fun, that whole scene. Yeah.
Yeah, because you reference butchers, specters, phantoms. Those are, I'd say, the only ones you get close to calling by name, because you're referencing dude's got a giant butcher's cleaver. So sure, he's a butcher. Obviously, if it was a dude with a club, you'd be like, what do we call him? But you give him the qualities so that a Night Stalker or any other player would be like, okay, I know what to associate with that one. When then Mind Screech comes through, you're like, this with mouths and eyes and stuff. And I was like, that feels like a Mind Screech. And then you're like, and then it screeches at people. And like, Gotcha. Okay, we're on the same page. So describing how they look, how they act is a good way to put it. I would think, yeah, maybe there is some place that has a reference book on what these are, but the vast majority of the time someone comes across Night Stalkers, they're not surviving. So you don't have, a great way of getting that knowledge written down and kind of storing that up. Plus, I would think if you start writing down their names, I don't know, somehow they would show up. Like there's this weird mythos of, yeah, sure, you want to write down a whole lot of information about whatever, eldritch horror, because that's not going to be bad. And somebody, I'm sure, somewhere has done it, and we get to have a fun elven library that suddenly all the books start pouring Night Stalkers out of because they wrote down too many of them. that sort of vibe. I did have a couple of questions, and Erasmus, if I'm taking any thunder from you, any of these, my apologies, because you may have some as well. I wanted to ask a few questions as we wrap up the story part to you, James. One, the spear of, I believe it's Eostis. Is there any lore background to that, or were you like, hey, I'm just going to pull a name out and kind of move forward there? What was kind of the background behind that? Was that being Aaliyah's staff spear weapon, and then obviously it gets unveiled that it's this what seems like a very impressive magical weapon, and she kind of burns it to stop the abyss from invading. So it obviously had a lot of power.
Definitely more the latter, I would say. It was, I'd sort of established that what was, or in my mind, what was going to close the portal or nullify it was as I wanted these hints to come through from the myth around the huntress that ultimately sets all this off, the Ardavikian legend that sets off the quest and everything. And that there's an idea in the story of like bits of truth being peppered through these stories. And so the idea, and there was a version of the book where the myth was laid out in much more detail, but it ultimately it wasn't helpful because it almost revealed too much in some ways. But but it's sort of relayed, the broad important details are relayed earlier in the novel by Dargent, and then yes, there's an idea that what in the myth the huntress had closed the portal by firing a divine sort of a shining one enchanted weapon arrow through the portal. And so it was like, okay, well, that's going to come around again. So she's got to carry some artifact. And I'd always had the idea that she was, in feigning being devoted of the Brotherhood, she would have this staff that would turn out to be this weapon in disguise, this classic Basilean spear, very like the kind of two-handed, Kalisko spear that we see on these in the sort of men-at-arms classic thing, but more ornate, and this would be enchanted in some way to fulfill that function in the plot. Yeah, so no, definitely the latter. I pulled that one out of where the sun doesn't shine, shall we say? Yeah.
Erasmus, did you have any questions about lore and things? I got another one. I want to make sure I'm keeping you in the loop. If you've got a thing that sort of is sitting in the back of your brain about these components as we close it out.
I think we've covered most of my questions. They were mostly about female orcs.
All right, so the last one I had, and then I know we'll jump into the last part of the cast here in a moment. Does Orad meet Dream Hunter? Because it's this dream thing that's out there, but I know Dream Hunter is like the only one of the few named characters for the Night Stalkers. Is that a evolution of Orad to being a Dream Hunter or the Dream Hunter?
I'm afraid, that question just can't be answered. I'm afraid that it is entirely for the reader to decide, basically because I have no permission to give any kind of answer on that. I did not ask permission, but it's so it's vague, but yeah.
I'm good with intentionally vague. There's nothing wrong with that. I think there's the bad guy could come back, the final moment of the hand reaching up to grasp, those sort of, again, horror vibes that you get of, well, the Orad's not dead and now he's more than just Orad, or he's Orad no longer, the thing that used to be Orad. So I think there's a lot of really interesting potential there. I think and again, you could write what you write, do what you do, but if you're like, hey, I'm going to write another Claws story, or, oh, hey, I'm going to write and Orad comes back in some other way, there's a lot of paths that you and or someone else, depending on how you feel comfortable about it, could go with a lot of threads that are still out there. There's still pieces that could be, we could see Knockrag's story evolve. We could see, where does she end up going? What does her life end up looking like? A lot of cool threads that are still out there. That'd be fun to see and explore. All right. Well, we're gonna shift into the last bit, which are quickfire questions. So I'll walk through these and then we'll all give our answers on them. So Erasmus, who was your favorite character in the book?
Every time you ask me this, I say the grizzled old commander. And this story has the base grizzled old commander, so I'm going to say the Silver Cat.
I think my favorite had to be Knockrag, just because she was more character than I thought she was going to be, and she has a lot of intricacies going on, and she's sort of the outside figure that becomes very integral to the story. She was a great piece. James, who is your favorite character?
It's got to be the Silver Cat, Uzo Dargent, for me as well. He's a character that I obviously know the most there is to know about him. I guess you could argue, although again, what's not in print is only my own fan fiction as it stands. But he's also just such a mystery to me as well. And I'm kind of fascinated by him myself. It's slightly self-indulgent, but there you go.
All right, Erasmus, what was the part in the story that made you, we would say, angriest or saddest, the most emotional part in the story for you?
I'd say the Vix being exploited got the most emotion out of me.
Mine was honestly probably the death of the female orc, just from a lack of care from the orc. So how alien they are in having no emotion and having no connection. It's like, oh, I'm with this person, they die, and you see Orad be angry about it, but it's not because he has a connection to her at an emotional level. It's that a thing of his got killed. And so it's that sort of innate desire for that character to have more, to be bigger, to be more emotionally connected, but it's impossible because that's not what they're capable of. It's just so very foreign to us. Just to think, wow, that's a death that nobody is going to mourn because those characters are incapable of knowing how to do that. James, is there any part of it that had for you as the author, an emotional response to what you were writing or the story that was in your head?
Yeah, I would probably say, in a similar way to your one, Nathan, it would be the death of the Plainsman character Ryun down in the underground fight, because I liked that character, and I felt like it was the right moment for that. It made sense with everything that was going on. He would attack, Orad would kill him, but given that it was from Orad's perspective, it had to be so dismissive and such, a small thing for him to just kill this person that he doesn't know, obviously, but we know, and it felt, cruel of myself for it to be so dismissive. But yeah,
it's one of those moments where you have in your head, there's the person who jumps in from the side to save the main character, and you're like, in your head as the reader, oh, this guy's probably going to die, but it's going to set up the cool thing that the person does. But then the bad guy's just like, okay, kill you, move on. And they don't really get the chance to save. There's a fraction of a second where they distract, but it's not really enough to save anyone. And yet something else still has to happen. And you're like, man, you just kind of died for no reason, but it wasn't for no reason. There was some brief moment of salvation. There's that extra half heartbeat that's there, but it just exemplifies the ability to wipe out a human life from the orc's perspective, and just oh, okay, it's just a dude. I killed the dude. And how very different it was from to tell that from Orad's perspective versus telling her from someone else's perspective, and seeing how that came through. All right, Erasmus, what was your, and I always have trouble with this one, most thoughtful, thought-provoking, poignant moment that kind of stuck out to you?
I'm torn between two answers. I'll harken back to the two mercenary commanders finding some common ground, the ogre and and Ursula talking and finding common ground was special to me. But also the sort of last stand at the end, where you as the reader knows that these Night Stalkers are about to evaporate, but the characters are fighting and sacrificing to survive because they don't know there's a clock that's ticking down. That tugged my heartstrings a bit.
I probably, and it might be a little bit cheating, but thought provoking was the amount of twist that Corla goes through at the end. How all these plans and all this setup, and they've laid out everything, and there's this grand design, and then they get the portal open, and they're like, 7th layer of the abyss. I'm awesome. I'm great. And their ex-boss is just like, no, it's me, man. Like, this is my phone number. And this setup, because again, it is, you don't know that's the setup. And then you get the Corla explaining to their underlings, hey, here's the thing. We've got the thing in place. And it's like the reverse of Ursula, where, yeah, they trust him, but it's not real trust. There's not real love. There's no actual, foundation that's built there, but they're willing to go along with this crazy scheme because then they're going to follow this person who is now a super high level abyssal. And all their hopes are pinned on this, and they're like, guaranteed, flip that switch, it's going to do the thing. And it's just their former boss on the other side that's just like, nah, I have to wipe you out because, I can't trust you anymore. And just the level of the amount of Corla's just complete despair I would feel at that moment of all of this. Everything we've gone through has been for literally nothing. It was very intriguing to me. James, what was your most thoughtful or thought-provoking or poignant moment?
I would say it's probably the final conversation and farewell that goes on between, various characters in that final chapter before the epilogue, but mainly I would say between Severe and Cowan, the young plainsman, who I would say as well was quite a surprise as a character to me. I mean, he was always there and he was always playing the part he played, but he definitely was a piece that is sort of revealed himself as it went on. He told, originally there wasn't so much of an arc for him as a character, but he made it clear as I was writing, that there is, that he's going on a journey here, and this culmination of this journey, this sort of between him and Zavir, where he's really, realizing, finding a balance between himself as an individual and the reality that he needs to rely on others and can therefore be relied on by others, and that whole journey for him. I found that quite poignant, and and then broadly with Uzel himself later in that chapter and his men, that was just signing off there at the end. That was obviously for the writer, that was quite a nice moment.
Awesome. We're going to jump into the last one, which is the what were you most surprised by? And I'm going to, hopefully not steal thunder. I was most surprised by, honestly, the pivot to the Abyssals. So the shift to the Abyssals coming out, which I know is a little bit also my most thoughtful moment, but it's the prelude to that, of the unveiling of Corla as what was Arlok. And I'm honestly just reversing your name and being a different person is the most pulp level villain thing ever. But it's just this is really who I am. And, this goblin is really a warlock. And there's like this, it was obviously well planned on your part, James, but as the reader, you're just like, well, now everything's upside down. And all the things that we thought might have been there, it's different now. So hopefully I didn't steal too much thunder from you, Erasmus, but what was your most surprising moment?
I was going to say that.
That's why I went first.
Instead, I'll go with Lady Orcs again.
Lady Orcs again. James, what surprised you about the story? Because I know for most of our authors, usually like, oh, this is a lot of surprises, but you have said multiple times, you had the story laid out. So were there any surprises for you? What kind of, if anything, took you off guard?
Yeah, it was. I think I've kind of already slightly done that because it was that character of Cowan, the young plainsman, and just what his journey would be. That just wasn't in that initial plan, specifically. So that was a nice surprise that just sort of unfolded really.
Awesome. No, that's good, and that's for me. It's good to hear an author say that there was something that happened that was different, and for you, it had to have, I think, been the characters. It had to have been the evolution they went through, because you had a good plot, you had a good story, and you stuck with it. You didn't have a whole lot of journeys and exploration. You were like, hey, this is the story. This is the story as it is. I think that's great. That's a great way to approach it. And then good to see you're surprised by the characters, because that's usually what most authors have. Sometimes it's a little thing here or there that occurs, but usually ends up being their characters kind of surprise them in some way, which is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap things up here today. But I did want to ask for you, James, is this, again, kind of horror-esque writing something you're going to hopefully continue on? Are there any works coming up in the future from you? Kind of what's the next step for you on all this?
So there's nothing at the moment on the books. I mean, it's a very good time to be a fan of Panathor lore, Tales of Panathor. I mean, we've got a whole really booked up slate coming out by the looks of it. I mean, I have no inside knowledge on that. I'm just looking at it from the outside. I can just see, God, there's some great names there and some great titles, and it looks like they've got it well planned out. So that is exciting. But from myself, there's nothing at the moment in that direction. But, as I've been saying to folk who have enjoyed this book, I have many other stories involving the claws, in my mind. And, if anyone wants to read them, they're going to have to, let folk know and spread the word. And if there's anything we know about both Mantic and Winged Hussar, is that they're very receptive to what their readers and what their gamers want. So, yeah.
No, it's good to know. And absolutely. If you've got more Claws stories, I, for one, would love to read them. I think it would be great to have a recurring sort of pulpy line to things, because we have different authors doing different things, and there's different perspectives into the world of Panathor. I think now having a book that kind of kicks into horror, pulpy, Lovecraftian, we obviously have, hey, ships and pirates, and we have, grand heroes. We have the big lore background stuff. We have dwarven politics. There's all these different ways that you can approach the world, and nothing is just, it has to be this way. All their books have to have the same feel and the same vibe. Winged Hussar and Mantic have both, it feels like, encouraged authors to come in and do something that doesn't align with where everyone else is, because it's what's good for the readers, because you get more readers, and it's what's good for the authors as well. So that's really cool. Any final thoughts from you, Erasmus?
I'd look forward to more Claws books. And are there any thoughts for the next one?
As I say, I have many stories, and the next one I have it, but it's just a question of, if there's demand for it, that this was, I should be clear that there's nothing on the books with Winged Hussar. They've got their slate. They're doing great work. There's nothing on the books right now, but, it's really in the hands of the readers at this point as to, what they want from this world. And so, I'd be honored if they wanted more of the Claws and, or anything else. But, it's just, remains to be seen.
I will do what I can to push it more and see if we can get you on the books at some point in the future, because I'd love to read more myself.
Awesome.
All right, everyone, has been great to spend some time with James and Erasmus to go over Claws on the Plain. And if you, again, have somehow gotten to this point in this podcast and still haven't read the book, go get the book, read the book. We need James to write more stuff. We need to get more Claws stories out there. If you haven't already, you can find more information, a bit more, in the Kings of War wiki. There's obviously going to be some more information on the Countercharge Facebook page. And I'm sure more will get put out there as this gets released, and we'll have some more conversations in the comments. But for now, from everyone here in Loremaster's library, keep reading, and as always, keep countercharging.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Countercharge. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at counterchargepodcast@gmail.com, on Twitter @countercharge15, or by commenting on the Countercharge Kings of War podcast Facebook group. If you enjoy the show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Until next time, keep countercharging. Music is a composition of Kevin MacLeod and is licensed under Creative Commons.